Before we dive into this absolutely wild story of revenge, family drama, and the sweetest payback you've ever heard, make sure you're comfortable because this one's a roller coaster. Hit that subscribe button right now because Ashley's about to serve up some life lessons that will have you questioning every relationship in your life. And if you love stories about strong women who refuse to be walked on, smash that like button. Trust me, you're going to want to share this one with every person who's ever been taken advantage of by family. Now, let me tell you about the dinner party that changed everything. My name is Ashley Rashford, and at 59, I've learned that the most devastating weapons aren't forged in steel. They're crafted in silence, patience, and the careful withdrawal of generosity from those who mistake kindness for weakness. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across my mahogany dining table that October evening, each facet catching the candlelight like tiny stars. I'd spent the afternoon arranging white orchids in silver vases, polishing the family china until it gleamed, and selecting the perfect wine to complement Chef Marcus's autumn menu. Everything had to be perfect for my monthly dinner party, a tradition I'd maintained for 7 years, ever since my husband Julian passed away. The guests were arriving fashionably late, as expected. Eleanor Prescott, my dearest friend since boarding school, swept in wearing emerald silk that complemented her silver hair perfectly. Behind her came the Weatherbys, the Montgomerys, and several other couples from our social circle. Each greeting was warm, each embrace genuine. These were people I'd known for decades, who'd watched me build my real estate empire from nothing after Julian's death, who respected the quiet strength I'd cultivated in my years of widowhood. "Ashley, darling, you look absolutely radiant," Eleanor whispered as she kissed my cheek. At 62, she maintained the razor-sharp wit and impeccable taste that had made her the unofficial queen of our social set. "That shade of burgundy is divine on you." I smoothed my silk dress, a custom piece from my favorite designer, and smiled. "Thank you, Elle. You know how I believe in making an effort." The irony wasn't lost on me. I always made an effort. For my friends, my home, my appearance. And for the past 7 years, I'd made considerable effort for my son Nathan and his wife Caroline, though they seemed to have forgotten that particular detail. Speaking of which, they were the last to arrive. Nathan, my only child, walked in looking handsome but slightly uncomfortable in his tailored suit. At 35, he had his father's gentle brown eyes and my stubborn chin, though he'd inherited none of my steel spine. Caroline followed behind him, and I had to admit she was striking. Honey blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists.
Diamonds de purchasa y raminda myself.
Along with the dress, the shoes, the purse, and virtually everything else she owned. "Mother Ashley," Caroline said, offering me her cheek for a kiss. The endearment sounded forced, as it always did. She'd never been able to bring herself to call me anything warmer, despite my repeated invitations to simply use my first name. "Caroline, you look lovely," I replied, meaning it. She did look lovely.
She always did.
That was part of the problem. Nathan hugged me properly, his embrace warm and genuine. "Thanks for having us, Mom. The table looks incredible as always." "You know I live for these gatherings," I said, and it was true. There was something deeply satisfying about bringing people together, about creating moments of beauty and connection. It was a skill I'd honed over the years, turning my home into a sanctuary where friendships deepened and memories were made. We moved into the living room for cocktails, and I watched the familiar dance of social interaction unfold. Eleanor regaled the Weatherbys with her latest travel adventures, while Charles Montgomery discussed his art collection with Dr. Harrison. Caroline positioned herself near the center of the room, her laughter a bit too bright, her gestures a bit too animated. She was performing, as she always did, playing the role of the perfect society wife. "Ashley, These canapes are exquisite, Margaret Weatherby complimented, taking another smoked salmon tartlet from the silver tray. You must give me your caterer's number. Actually, these are from Chef Marcus, I replied. He's been with me for 3 years now. Trained at Le Cordon Bleu. Caroline's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. Oh, Mother Ashley and her staff, she said with a tinkling laugh. She has people for absolutely everything. A chef, a housekeeper, a gardener, personal shoppers. Must be nice to never have to lift a finger. The room went quiet for just a moment, that particular kind of silence that falls when someone says something that hovers on the edge of propriety. I felt Eleanor's sharp gaze flick between Caroline and me, her social antennae immediately alert to the undercurrent of tension. Well, I said smoothly, I believe in supporting local talent and making life beautiful for the people I care about. Caroline's smile never wavered. Of course you do. You're so generous with your resources. The word hung in the air like smoke. Resources. Not money, not gifts, not the thousands upon thousands of dollars I'd poured into their life together. Resources. As if I were some kind of utility to be tapped. I sipped my wine and let the conversation flow around me. But something had crystallized in that moment. Something cold and sharp and final. Dinner was announced, and we moved to the dining room. I'd seated myself at the head of the table, with Nathan to my right and Eleanor to my left. Caroline was positioned across from her husband, between Dr. Harrison and Charles Montgomery, a place of honor that she seemed to consider her due. The first course arrived, and conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine. We discussed upcoming charitable events, travel plans for the holidays, and the latest exhibition at the museum. I played the perfect hostess, ensuring everyone's glass remained full and guiding the discussion with the skill of someone who'd been entertaining for decades. It was during the main course, a perfectly prepared rack of lamb with rosemary and garlic, that Caroline decided to make her fatal mistake. Dr. Harrison was telling a story about his grandson's college applications when Caroline interrupted with another of her bright laughs. Oh, speaking of expenses, she said, I was just telling my book club how lucky we are that Nathan married into such security. I mean, some people have to actually worry about money. She gestured around the table with her wine glass, taking in the crystal, the china, the soft glow of candlelight. It must be so stressful, wondering how you'll pay for things. Thank goodness we don't have that problem. The comment was thoughtless rather than deliberately cruel, but it landed with the impact of a slap. Several of our guests shifted uncomfortably. The Weatherbys, I happen to know, have been struggling since Charles's law firm downsized. The Montgomerys were refinancing their home to pay for their daughter's wedding. But Caroline wasn't finished. Perhaps emboldened by the wine, or maybe just unable to read the room, she leaned forward with that same bright smile. I was just saying to Elle yesterday. She nodded toward Eleanor, who looked mortified to be dragged into whatever was coming. How funny it is that some people think marriage should be an equal partnership. I mean, why struggle when you don't have to, right, Mother Ashley? She took another sip of wine, her eyes glittering with what she probably thought was sophisticated humor. After all, how does it feel to be such a leech? The question was directed at me, accompanied by another of those tinkling laughs. Around the table, I could see my guests' faces frozen in various expressions of shock and embarrassment. Nathan had gone pale, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Eleanor's eyes had narrowed to dangerous slits. But it was the laughter that did it. Not just Caroline's, but the uncomfortable chuckles from several other guests who didn't know how else to respond to such brazen rudeness. They were laughing at me. In my own home, at my own table. I set down my wine glass with deliberate precision. The crystal made the softest chime as it touched the table, but in the sudden silence, it sounded like a bell tolling. How does it feel to be such a leech? I repeated thoughtfully. as if considering the question seriously. What an interesting question, Caroline. I looked around the table, meeting each guest's eyes in turn. Some looked away, others watched with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car accident. I suppose I wouldn't know, I continued, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. But you might be the better person to ask that question. Caroline's smile flickered slightly, but she was still riding the wave of her own perceived cleverness. Oh, Mother Ashley, you know what I mean. You're so good to us. So generous. Yes, I agreed. I have been generous. Remarkably so, actually. I picked up my wineglass again, swirling the deep red liquid thoughtfully. The room was so quiet I could hear the soft tick of the antique clock on the sideboard. Which is why I find your questions so fascinating, I said. Because in my experience, leeches are creatures that attach themselves to a host and drain its life force without giving anything in return. Caroline's laughter was sounding more strained now. Well, when I put it that way, I interrupted gently, I have to wonder, how does it feel to know this leech will no longer be paying your bills? The words dropped into the silence, like stones into still water. I watched the ripples spread across Caroline's face. Confusion first, then dawning understanding, then something approaching panic. I'm sorry, she said, her voice suddenly much smaller. You heard me correctly, I replied, taking a sip of my wine. I've decided to stop being such a leech. Effective immediately. Nathan finally found his voice. Mom, what are you talking about? I turned to him with a gentle smile. I'm talking about the mortgage on your house, darling. The one I've been paying for 7 years. And the utilities. And the credit cards. And the car payments. All the ways I've been. What was the word Caroline used? Leeching? Caroline had gone very still, her fork frozen in her hand. You can't be serious. Oh, but I am. I raised my glass in a toast. To independence, Caroline. To standing on your own 2 feet. To finding out what it really means to be a leech. Around the table, my guests sat in stunned silence. Eleanor's eyes were bright with something that might have been admiration. Nathan looked stricken, his gaze darting between his wife and me. But it was Caroline's face that I studied most carefully. The color had drained from her cheeks, leaving her foundation looking pale and artificial. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her wineglass, and I could see the exact moment when the full implications of my words hit her. 7 years of payments. 7 years of security. 7 years of never having to worry about money because Ashley Rashford, the leech, had made sure they never had to. The lamb is exceptional tonight, I said conversationally, cutting another bite. Chef Marcus has really outdone himself. And just like that, I continued eating, as if I hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of my elegant dinner party. Around me, conversation slowly resumed, though it was stilted and careful. People began making excuses to leave early, sensing the tension that now filled the room like smoke. Caroline said nothing for the rest of the meal. She pushed food around her plate and drank too much wine, her earlier vivacity completely extinguished. Nathan kept shooting worried glances between us, clearly trying to figure out how to navigate this unexpected minefield. When the last guest had gone home, Eleanor squeezing my hand and whispering, "Call me tomorrow, darling," I began clearing the table. Caroline and Nathan lingered in the dining room, and I could hear them speaking in urgent, hushed tones. "She can't be serious," Caroline was saying. "She's just making a point. She'll cool off." "I don't know," Nathan replied, and his voice carried a note I hadn't heard in years. Uncertainty. Mom doesn't usually make idle threats. I smiled as I loaded the dishwasher. No, I certainly didn't make idle threats. And after 7 years of being taken for granted, 7 years of having my generosity treated as an entitlement, 7 years of being called a leech by the woman who'd been bleeding me dry. Well, it was time to see how Caroline handled life without her host. The game had begun, and I intended to win. Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. And if you're loving the drama, smash that like button because Caroline's about to learn some very expensive lessons. Now, let's see what happened next. The morning after the dinner party, I sat in my study with my first cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. My home office had always been my sanctuary, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive oak desk that had belonged to my father, and windows overlooking the gardens Julian had designed before he died. This was where I'd built my empire. After Julian's sudden heart attack 8 years ago, everyone expected me to quietly manage his investments and live off the dividends like a proper widow. Instead, I'd throw myself into real estate development with a vengeance that surprised even me. I had a gift for seeing potential where others saw problems, for transforming neglected properties into coveted addresses. The coffee was still steaming when my phone rang. Nathan's name appeared on the screen. "Good morning, sweetheart," I answered. "Mom." His voice was tight with stress. "We need to talk." "Of course. Are you coming over? Can you come here?" She's pretty upset." I glanced at my calendar. I had a property showing at 11 and a meeting with my architect at 2. "I can spare an hour." "Thank you." The drive to Nathan's house, my house, technically, since I held the mortgage, took 15 minutes through tree-lined streets where autumn was painting the maples in brilliant reds and golds. It was a beautiful neighborhood, one of the most prestigious in the city, and the Tudor-style home was genuinely stunning. I'd helped them choose it 7 years ago, when Caroline was pregnant with a child they ultimately lost, and Nathan's salary as a marketing manager couldn't come close to covering the payments. Caroline answered the door, wearing silk pajamas that probably cost more than most people's rent. Her face was puffy from crying, and she'd made no attempt to hide it. Perhaps she thought her distress would move me. "Ashley," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "Thank you for coming." Nathan appeared behind her, already dressed for work in a suit I'd bought him for Christmas 2 years ago.
Mom, come in.
"Please." The living room was a showcase of expensive taste, Italian leather furniture, original artwork, Persian rugs that cost more than cars. Everything beautiful, everything perfect, everything paid for with my money. I settled into the chair I'd always preferred, crossing my legs and smoothing my skirt. Both of them remained standing, which told me they'd discussed strategy before I arrived. "I assume Caroline told you she's upset," I said calmly. "Mom." Nathan ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was struggling with something difficult. "What you said last night, did you mean it?" "Which part?" "About the mortgage. The bills. All of it." I looked at him steadily. "My son. My only child. The baby I'd carried for 9 months. The toddler who'd climbed into my bed during thunderstorms. The teenager who'd brought me flowers every Mother's Day. I loved him with every fiber of my being. But love and enabling were not the same thing, and I'd finally learned the difference. "Yes," I said simply. I meant every word. Caroline sank onto the sofa, as if her legs had given out. "But why? What did we do wrong?" "I was just joking last night. You know that, right? It was just dinner party banter." "Dinner party banter," I repeated. "Is that what you call humiliating your host in front of her guests?" "I wasn't trying to humiliate you."
No.
I tilted my head, studying her. "Then what were you trying to do when you called me a leech? When you laughed about how lucky you were not to worry about money? When you made sure everyone at my table knew that my generosity was something you took for granted?" Nathan sat down heavily beside his wife. "Mom, Caroline didn't mean..." "Nathan." My voice was sharper than I'd intended, and he fell silent. Do you remember when you first brought Caroline home? You'd been dating for 6 months, and you were so nervous about introducing her to me. A small smile tugged at his lips despite the tension. I remember. You made that incredible dinner and you told stories about Dad and you showed her his rose garden. Do you remember what I told you that night after she'd gone home? He was quiet for a moment. You said you could see how much she loved me, and that anyone who made me that happy was welcome in our family. That's right. I meant it then, and I mean it now. Caroline is welcome in our family, but being welcome doesn't mean being entitled to drain our resources while treating the source with contempt. Caroline's face crumpled. I never meant to treat you with contempt.
I'm grateful, Ashley.
You know I am. Are you? I opened my purse and pulled out a small leather notebook, the kind I'd always used for keeping track of appointments and important dates. Let me read you something I wrote down 3 months ago. It was at the charity luncheon for the Children's Hospital. I flipped to the right page. You were talking to Jennifer Morrison and Susan Walsh. You said, and I quote, "Oh, Mother Ashley takes care of everything. I literally never have to think about money. It's like having a fairy godmother, except she's real and she can't say no." Caroline's face went white. I don't remember saying that. Or this one from Christmas last year. You were opening presents I'd spent weeks selecting and wrapping, and you said to your sister, "The old girl really outdid herself this year. I just send her my wish list, and she takes care of everything." "Mom," Nathan said quietly, "how long have you been writing these down?" 2 years, I admitted. Ever since I started noticing the pattern. Every gift taken for granted. Every payment made without acknowledgement. Every joke made at my expense about how easy your life is because of my generosity. I closed the notebook and returned it to my purse. I kept thinking things would change, that you'd realize what you were doing and show some appreciation, some respect. Instead, it got worse. Last night was just the final straw. Caroline was crying now, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry.
I'll apologize publicly. I'll tell everyone how grateful we are." "It's too late for apologies, Caroline. Do you know what I did after you left last night?"
She shook her head.
I call my financial advisor, and my attorney, and my accountant. I've spent 7 years tangled up in your finances, and it's going to take some time to untangle myself properly. But I've started the process. Nathan leaned forward. What does that mean, exactly? I'd been dreading this question, but I'd also been preparing for it. It means that starting next month, you'll be responsible for your own mortgage payment, your own utilities, your own credit card bills, your own car payments, everything. How much is that? Caroline whispered. Including the mortgage? About $8,000 a month. The number hit them like a physical blow. Nathan's salary was good, but not that good. Not even close. "We can't afford that," he said, his voice hollow. "I know. So, what are we supposed to do?" I looked at my son. My stubborn, kind, conflict-avoidant son who'd spent 7 years letting his wife spend my money while he buried his head in the sand and pretended not to see what was happening. "You're supposed to figure it out," I said. "You're 35 years old, Nathan. You're intelligent and capable and hardworking. You don't need me to solve your problems. But the house will be foreclosed on if you can't make the payments, which means you'll need to downsize. Significantly." Caroline made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. "You'd let us lose our home?" "Caroline." I kept my voice gentle but firm. "It was never your home. It's my house. I've been letting you live in it. There's a difference." The truth of that statement settled over all of us like a weight. For 7 years, they'd lived in a house they couldn't afford, driven cars they couldn't pay for, worn clothes they couldn't buy, all while treating me like an ATM that never ran out of money. "I love you both," I said, standing up. That hasn't changed. But love doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior. It doesn't mean allowing myself to be disrespected and taken for granted. And it certainly doesn't mean continuing to pay for a lifestyle that's taught you to see me as nothing more than a source of funding. Nathan stood too, his face etched with something I rarely saw from him. Real distress. Mom, please. Can we work something out? Some kind of payment plan. There's nothing to work out, I said. You're adults. Act like it. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. Caroline was still sobbing on the sofa, and Nathan looked like he might be sick. One more thing, I said. The credit cards are being canceled today. I'd suggest you avoid any unnecessary shopping trips. And with that, I let myself out, climbed into my car, and drove away from the house I'd been paying for, leaving my son and his wife to confront the reality of their situation. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done. It was also, I realized, long overdue. Hit that like button if you think Ashley is handling this perfectly, or drop a comment if you think she's being too harsh. Either way, make sure you're subscribed because Caroline's about to discover just how expensive her lifestyle really is. Trent Donovan had been my financial advisor for 12 years, ever since Julian's death had made it necessary for me to understand the full scope of our holdings. At 68, he was silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and utterly discreet, qualities that had made him indispensable as I'd navigated my way from grieving widow to successful businesswoman. He arrived at my study that afternoon carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who'd spent the morning making difficult phone calls on my behalf. Ashley, he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. I've prepared everything you requested. All of it. Every account, every payment, every liability that connects you to Nathan and Caroline's finances. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. I have to say, I'm impressed by how thoroughly you've supported them, and appalled by how much it's cost you. I accepted the folder and began flipping through the pages. 7 years of financial support laid out in neat columns and careful documentation. Mortgage payments totaling $347,000. Utilities averaging $400 per month. A credit card payments ranging from $2,000 to $8,000 monthly, depending on Caroline's shopping habits. Car payments for both the BMW and the Lexus. Insurance. Property taxes. Maintenance and repairs. The total? I asked, though I'd already done the math in my head. Just over $600,000, Trent said quietly. Not including gifts, vacations, or the various emergencies you've covered over the years.
$600,000.
More than $500,000 spent on 2 people who thought it was amusing to call me a leech at dinner parties. The mortgage company called this morning, Trent continued. They wanted to confirm the change in payment structure. I told them the automatic payment would be discontinued and that Nathan Keller would be taking over responsibility for the account. How did they react to that? They expressed concern about his ability to qualify for the payments based on his current income. I smiled grimly. I imagine they did. Trent pulled out another document. The credit card companies were more accommodating. All secondary cards have been canceled as of noon today. The car leases are a bit more complex. They're under your corporate account, so I've initiated the termination process. The vehicles will need to be returned within 30 days. And the utilities? I've contacted each company and informed them that after this month's payment, the responsibility will transfer to Nathan Keller. They'll need to qualify for service under his name and credit rating. I leaned back in my chair, studying the paperwork. Each line item represented years of enabling, years of avoiding conflict by simply writing checks. It had seemed easier at the time. Nathan was happy, Caroline was happy, and I could afford it. But easier wasn't always better, and I was finally ready to acknowledge that truth. There's one more thing, Trent said carefully. The house. Yes. It's worth approximately $800,000 in today's market. The outstanding mortgage balance is $180,000. If you wanted to maintain ownership and charge them rent instead of gift payments. I considered this. It would be the merciful option, the one that would preserve family harmony and give them time to adjust. It was what the old Ashley might have done. The Ashley who prioritized peace over principle, who enabled rather than empowered. No, I said firmly. If I wanted to be their landlord, I would have structured it that way from the beginning. They need to understand that their lifestyle has been built on my generosity, not their own achievements. Trent nodded approvingly. I thought you might say that. In that case, I've prepared a timeline for the transition. They have this month, October, covered by your final payments. November 1st, they're on their own. That gives them 3 weeks to figure things out. More than enough time for capable adults to assess their situation and make appropriate adjustments. I signed the documents one by one, each signature feeling like cutting a rope that had been binding me for 7 years. The mortgage transfer, the credit card cancellations, the utility disconnections. Each page represented a step toward freedom. Their freedom to succeed or fail on their own merits, and my freedom from being treated like an inexhaustible resource. There's something else, Trent said as he collected the signed papers. I took the liberty of looking into Caroline's spending patterns over the past year. He handed me a computer printout showing credit card activity broken down by category. The numbers were staggering. $3,200 per month on clothing and accessories. $1,800 on restaurants and entertainment. $900 on beauty treatments. $600 on what was listed simply as miscellaneous luxury items. She's been spending almost $7,000 a month on non-essentials, Trent said. That's in addition to the mortgage, utilities, and car payments you've been covering. I stared at the numbers, feeling a familiar tightness in my chest. Not guilt. I was past that now, but amazement at my own blindness. How had I let it go on for so long? How had I convinced myself that this was normal, that this was love? The car situation will be the first crisis, Trent predicted. The lease company is required to give 30 days notice, but they're not required to allow the vehicles to be purchased at the end of lease value. If Nathan and Caroline want to keep the cars, they'll need to qualify for financing at full retail price, which they can't afford. Not even close. The BMW alone would require monthly payments of $850, and that's with excellent credit. Nathan's credit history shows he's never held significant debt in his own name. Everything has been guaranteed by you. He's essentially a financial ghost. The term struck me as apartment Nathan had been living as a financial ghost, supported entirely by my substance, while taking none of the responsibility for building his own credit, his own assets, his own security. And Caroline had been even worse. She'd never worked, never built anything, never contributed to their household in any measurable way beyond her decorative presence. The utilities will be the second crisis, Trent continued. Electric, gas, water, trash, internet, cable, it's going to be about $600 per month, and most companies will require deposits for new service. Given Nathan's limited credit history, those deposits could be substantial. How substantial? Potentially several $1,000s up front, just to keep the lights on. I thought about Caroline's reaction that morning, her certainty that I was bluffing, that I would eventually relent and resume my role as their personal ATM. She had no idea what she was facing. Neither of them did. The mortgage will be the final crisis, Trent said. When November's payment doesn't arrive, they'll have a 30-day grace period. Then another 30 days before foreclosure proceedings begin. If they're lucky and the bank is feeling generous, they might have 90 days total before they're evicted. And the house will go to auction. Almost certainly. Properties in that neighborhood usually sell quickly, even in foreclosure. I made a mental note to have someone monitor the auction. Not because I wanted to buy the house back, I didn't, but because I was curious to see what would happen to all those beautiful things Caroline had filled it with. The Italian leather furniture, the Persian rugs, the artwork and crystal and silver. All of it purchased with my money, none of it truly theirs. Is there anything else I need to know? I asked. Trent hesitated. Ashley, are you sure about this? I'm not questioning your decision. God knows they've treated you abominably, but once these processes are in motion, they'll be very difficult to reverse. I thought about his question seriously. Was I sure? Was I prepared to watch my son and his wife lose everything they'd taken for granted? Was I ready to be seen as the villain in their story, the cruel mother-in-law who'd pulled the rug out from under them? I'm sure, I said. They called me a leech, Trent. In my own home, in front of my friends. After 7 years of my supporting their lifestyle, they thought it was funny to humiliate me publicly. People say things they don't mean when they've been drinking. Caroline wasn't drunk. She was entitled. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. Then we proceed as planned. After Trent left, I sat alone in my study as shadows lengthened across the polished wood floor. Somewhere across town, Nathan and Caroline were probably having intense discussions about budgets and cutbacks and damage control. Caroline was likely calling her friends, trying to maintain her social calendar while privately panicking about money. Nathan was probably looking at their bank account balance and wondering how long they could survive on his salary alone. I felt a moment of sadness. Not regret, but sadness for the years we'd lost, the relationship that might have been if they'd treated my generosity as a gift rather than an entitlement. But the sadness was tempered by something else. Anticipation. For the first time in 7 years, I was about to find out who they really were when they couldn't depend on my money to solve their problems. And they were about to discover what it truly meant to be responsible for their own choices. The first cut had been made. The others would follow soon enough. Can you feel the tension building? Drop a handclap emoji in the comments if you think Ashley is doing the right thing, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens when Caroline faces her first real crisis. 2 weeks after my dinner party revelation, I was having lunch with Eleanor at our favorite bistro downtown when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number.
This is Caroline. Please call me.
It's urgent. I showed the message to Eleanor, who raised an eyebrow over her salad. She's reaching out already? That was faster than I expected. Trent warned me the car situation would be the first crisis. I replied, silencing my phone and returning it to my purse. I imagine that's what this is about. Are you going to call her back? Eventually, but not while I'm enjoying lunch with my dearest friend. Eleanor smiled approvingly.
Good.
Let her sweat a bit. Though I have to admit, I'm curious about how this is all unfolding. It's unfolding exactly as expected, I said, cutting into my salmon. Caroline called Nathan in hysterics yesterday morning when she tried to use the credit card at Nordstrom, and it was declined. According to Nathan, who called me 3 times, by the way, she was humiliated in front of the sales associate. Oh, the horror, Eleanor said dryly. Being treated like a normal person who has to live within their means. Nathan asked if I would reconsider, just temporarily, until they could adjust their budget. I told him there was nothing to adjust. They simply needed to live on what they actually earned instead of what I was willing to give them. How did he take that? About as well as you'd expect. He's caught between Caroline's panic and his own realization that he's never actually had to be financially responsible. It's quite the awakening.
My phone buzzed again.
This time it was Nathan calling. I sent it to voicemail and continued eating. You know, Eleanor said thoughtfully, I've been thinking about that night at dinner. About the way Caroline spoke to you. The more I replay it, the angrier I get. Oh, the sheer audacity of it. To sit at your table, in your home, wearing clothes you paid for, drinking wine you provided, and call you a leech. In front of all of us. I'm still shocked that she had the nerve. I'd replayed that moment many times myself over the past 2 weeks. The sound of Caroline's laughter, the way our guests had shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the flash of malicious amusement in her eyes as she delivered what she thought was a devastating blow. What bothers me most, I said, is that it wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was calculated. She'd been thinking of me as a leech for who knows how long, and that night she finally felt comfortable enough to say it publicly. Well, she's certainly not feeling comfortable now. My phone rang again, Nathan, persistent as always. This time I answered. Hello, sweetheart. Mom. Thank God. Listen, there's been a mistake. 2 men just showed up at our house with a tow truck. They're trying to take Caroline's car. I glanced at my watch. Right on schedule. That's not a mistake, Nathan. The lease was terminated, remember? But they can't just take it without warning. Actually, they can. The 30-day notice was sent 2 weeks ago. Today is the return date. Through the phone, I could hear Caroline's voice in the background, shrill with panic. Tell her to stop this. Tell her we'll pay her back. Nathan, I said calmly, put me on speaker. A moment later, Caroline's voice came through clearly. Ashley, please. They're embarrassing us in front of the whole neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson is watching from her window, and the Morrisons' gardener is taking pictures. Caroline, the lease agreement was always in my name. I've terminated it. The car needs to be returned. But how am I supposed to get around? I have a hair appointment this afternoon. The sheer absurdity of her priorities, a hair appointment when her entire lifestyle was collapsing, would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. That's something you'll need to figure out, I said. Perhaps Nathan can drive you, or you could call a taxi. A taxi? Caroline's voice cracked. Do you know how much taxis cost? I imagine you're about to find out. Eleanor was trying not to smile, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She'd never liked Caroline, had told me years ago that the girl was trouble, and was clearly enjoying this conversation. Mom. Nathan's voice again, strained and desperate. Can we work something out? What if we took over the lease payments? The lease is terminated, Nathan. If you want a car, you'll need to buy or lease one under your own name. But our credit will need to be built, yes. Most adults do that in their 20s, but it's never too late to start. I could hear Caroline sobbing now, and I felt a familiar tug of guilt. But then I remembered her laughter 2 weeks ago, her casual cruelty, her absolute certainty that she could humiliate me without consequences. The men are waiting, I said. I suggest you remove any personal belongings from the vehicle. They won't be responsible for items left inside. I hung up before either of them could respond. How do you feel? Eleanor asked. I considered the question seriously. Surprisingly good, actually. For 7 years, I've been solving their problems before they even knew they had problems. It's fascinating to watch them actually have to deal with consequences. And Caroline's reaction? About what you'd expect from someone who's never faced a real challenge in her adult life. An hour later, as Eleanor and I were finishing our coffee, my phone buzzed with a text message. This time it was a photo from a number I didn't recognize, probably one of the neighbors. It showed Caroline standing in her driveway in silk pajamas and a robe, crying as men loaded her BMW onto a tow truck. Nathan stood beside her in his work clothes, looking helpless and defeated. Eleanor glanced at the photo and shook her head. She's making quite the spectacle of herself. I'm sure she is. Caroline has always believed that if she makes enough of a scene, someone will fix whatever's wrong. Usually that someone has been me. And now she gets to learn that tears don't pay bills. We parted ways outside the restaurant, and I drove home feeling oddly peaceful. The house felt especially welcoming as I walked through the front door, sunlight streaming through the windows, fresh flowers from my garden arranged in crystal vases, everything beautiful and serene and mine. I was settling into my study with a cup of tea when the doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see Nathan's car in my driveway. He'd borrowed someone's vehicle, apparently, or taken a very expensive taxi ride across town. I opened the door to find both Nathan and Caroline standing on my front porch. Caroline had changed into street clothes, but her eyes were red and puffy from crying. Nathan looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Mom," he said immediately, "we need to talk." "Of course."
Come in.
I led them to the living room and took my usual chair. They sat together on the sofa, and I noticed how Caroline clung to Nathan's hand like an anchor. "First," Nathan said, "Caroline has something to say to you." Caroline looked up at me with those blue eyes that had always been her best feature. "Ashley, I'm so sorry about what I said at dinner. I was completely out of line. I don't think you're a leech. I think you're the most generous person I know." The apology was clearly rehearsed, delivered with the kind of desperate sincerity that came from genuine panic. But it was also 2 weeks too late. "Thank you for saying that, Caroline. I appreciate the apology." Hope flickered in her eyes. "So you'll help us figure this out? You'll help us fix this?"
No.
The word hung in the air between us like a wall. Caroline's face crumpled, and Nathan leaned forward in his chair. "Mom, please. We get it now. We understand how much you've been doing for us. We were ungrateful, and we're sorry. But you can't just cut us off completely." "Why not?" "Because we're family." "Yes, we are. And families are supposed to love and support each other, not take advantage of each other." We weren't taking advantage. "Nathan." My voice was sharper than I'd intended. "You're 35 years old. You've been married for 8 years. In all that time, have you ever supported your wife financially? Have you ever been the one to pay the mortgage or the utilities or her credit card bills?" He was quiet for a long moment. "You offered to help. I offered to help you get started. 7 years ago, when Caroline was pregnant and you were both young and struggling. I didn't offer to support you indefinitely while you built a lifestyle you couldn't afford." Caroline finally spoke up, her voice small and shaky. "What are we supposed to do? We can't afford the house payment. We can't afford anything." "You'll figure it out," I said. "Most people do. But where will we live?" "Somewhere you can afford. Our friends, everyone we know, will understand that you're downsizing. Or they won't, and you'll discover which relationships were based on genuine affection and which were based on your ability to keep up with their lifestyle." Nathan stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back.
This is insane, Mom.
"You're destroying our lives over one stupid comment." "I'm not destroying anything, Nathan. I'm simply stopping enabling you to live beyond your means. If your life is destroyed by the loss of my financial support, then it was built on a very shaky foundation to begin with." Caroline was crying again, but quietly this time. "I'll get a job," she said suddenly. "I'll find work." "That's an excellent idea. But I don't have any experience. I don't have skills." "Then you'll need to acquire some. Quickly." The three of us sat in silence for several minutes. I could see them both processing the reality of their situation, the magnitude of the changes they would need to make. Caroline had never worked a day in her adult life. Nathan had never had to manage money because there had always been a safety net. They were facing a complete restructuring of their existence, and they were terrified. Part of me wanted to comfort them, to offer some small concession that would ease their transition. But then I remembered Caroline's laughter, her casual cruelty, her absolute certainty that she could humiliate me without consequences. And I remembered 7 years of being taken for granted, 7 years of having my generosity treated as an entitlement. "There's something else," I said. "I've been thinking about Christmas." They both looked at me with something approaching hope. For the past 7 years, I've spent roughly $10,000 each Christmas on gifts for the two of you. This year, I'll be donating that money to charity instead." Caroline made a sound like a wounded animal. Nathan closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. "I thought you should know," I continued, "so you can plan accordingly. You'll want to set aside money for gifts for each other." "Mom," Nathan said quietly, "I don't understand how you can be so cold about this. We're your family, and you'll always be my family. But I'm done being your A-team." I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "I love you both. I want you to be happy and successful. But from now on, your happiness and success will need to come from your own efforts, not from my bank account." They left without another word, Caroline leaning heavily on Nathan's arm as they walked to their borrowed car. I watched from my window as they drove away, and I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. For the first time in 7 years, I wouldn't be lying awake at night wondering what crisis I would need to solve next, what bill I would need to pay, what lifestyle choice I would need to fund. Their problems were their own now, and mine were mine. It was, I realized, exactly as it should be. Drop a comment. Was Ashley right to let them take the car, or should she have given them more warning? And hit that notification bell because shortly, we're diving into Caroline's most humiliating moment yet. The call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the car repossession. I was in a meeting with my architect, reviewing plans for a downtown loft conversion, when my assistant knocked and handed me a note. "Nathan says it's urgent." I excused myself and took the call in my private office. "Nathan? What's wrong?" "Mom." His voice was tight with stress. "Caroline's at the police station." My blood ran cold. "What happened? Is she hurt?" "No, she's—" God, this is embarrassing. "She's been arrested for shoplifting." I sat down heavily in my chair. Shoplifting. She was at Saks with Jennifer Morrison and Susan Walsh. Apparently, she tried to steal a pair of earrings. Security caught her walking out without paying. Jennifer Morrison and Susan Walsh, two of the biggest gossips in our social circle. If Caroline had been caught shoplifting in front of them, the story would be all over town by dinner time. How much were the earrings worth? $800. It's a felony, Mom. They're talking about pressing charges. I closed my eyes, trying to process this information. Caroline, who had never wanted for anything in her adult life, had been driven to shoplifting. It would have been almost vitiating if it weren't so completely predictable. "Where are you now?" "At the station. I had to leave work. My boss isn't happy, and I can't exactly explain that my wife was arrested for theft because we can't afford jewelry anymore." "Have you called a lawyer?" "We can't afford a lawyer, Mom. We can barely afford groceries." The desperation in his voice was real, and for a moment I wavered. This was my son asking for help. This was the boy I'd raised, who'd never asked for anything unreasonable until he'd married a woman who didn't understand the concept of living within one's means. "What do you want me to do, Nathan? Would you consider paying for legal representation? Just this once? I know you're angry with us, but this could ruin Caroline's life." "Caroline's choices are ruining Caroline's life," I said quietly. "I'm just no longer preventing her from experiencing the consequences." "So you won't help?" I thought about it seriously. I could call my attorney, could make this problem disappear with a phone call and a check. But then what? How long before Caroline's next crisis, her next moment of poor judgment that would require my intervention? "I'll help," I said finally, "but not in the way you're expecting." "What do you mean?" "I'll call David Morrison, Jennifer's husband. He's still on the board at Saks. I'll ask him to speak to the store manager about not pressing charges. But that's all I'll do." "Mom, thank you. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet. This is the last time, Nathan. The very last time I clean up one of Caroline's messes. After this, Whatever happens to either of you is entirely your responsibility. I hung up and immediately called David Morrison. The conversation was brief and deeply uncomfortable. Ashley, I'm so sorry, David said when I explained the situation. Jennifer called me an hour ago. She's devastated for you. I appreciate that. And I'd appreciate it if you could speak to the store manager. Caroline made a terrible mistake, but I don't think criminal charges will help anyone. Of course, I'll handle it. But Ashley, Jennifer said Caroline seemed desperate. Frantic, almost. Are they having financial troubles? They're having adjustment troubles, I said carefully. Learning to live within their means. David was too polite to ask follow-up questions, but I could hear the curiosity in his voice. By tomorrow, everyone in our circle would know that Caroline Keller had been caught shoplifting, and they would all be wondering why Ashley Rashford wasn't swooping in to fix the problem with her usual efficiency. 2 hours later, Nathan called back. They're dropping the charges. Caroline can go home.
Good.
Mom, I don't know how to thank you. You can thank me by making sure this never happens again. It won't. I promise. Caroline's learned her lesson. I wasn't so sure about that, but I didn't say so. Instead, I asked, how are you managing? Financially, I mean. Nathan was quiet for a moment. It's hard. Harder than I expected. We had to move out of the house last week. Where are you living? A 2-bedroom apartment across town. It's fine. Small, but fine. Caroline's having trouble adjusting. I imagine Caroline, who had spent 8 years in a 4,000-square-foot Tudor mansion, trying to adapt to apartment living. The culture shock must have been severe. And work. I picked up some freelance consulting work in the evenings. And Caroline got a job. This surprised me. Doing what? Retail. At a boutique downtown. Part-time, but it's something. I felt a flutter of something that might have been pride. Perhaps they were learning. Perhaps they were finally growing up. That's good to hear, Nathan. The money's tight, though. Really tight. We're living paycheck to paycheck, and every little emergency feels like a crisis. Like today's shoplifting incident, I thought but didn't say. Most people live that way, I pointed out gently. It's normal. I know. I never realized how much you were doing for us. How much we depended on you. It was the closest thing to genuine insight he'd shown in years, and it gave me hope that perhaps this painful experience was serving its purpose. That evening, Eleanor came over for dinner. Chef Marcus had prepared a simple but elegant meal, and we ate in my breakfast nook overlooking the garden. I heard about Caroline's little shopping adventure, Eleanor said over the fish course. News travels fast. Jennifer Morrison called 3 people before she even left the store. By now, half the city knows. I sighed. Poor Caroline. She's always cared so much about appearances. Well, she's certainly made an appearance today. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I've already done it. I had the charges dropped, but that's the end of my involvement. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. That's unusually restrained of you. Is it? The old Ashley would have hired the best criminal defense attorney in the state, then would have spent the weekend crafting a story to explain away the whole incident. You would have protected Caroline from any consequences whatsoever. She was right, of course. 6 months ago, I would have moved heaven and earth to shield Caroline from the embarrassment and legal consequences of her actions. I would have convinced myself that it was the loving thing to do, that family loyalty demanded it. The old Ashley enabled bad behavior by preventing people from experiencing consequences, I said. This Ashley is learning the difference between helping and enabling. And how does it feel? Terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Eleanor smiled.
Good.
That means you're doing it right. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone rang. Caroline's number appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Hello, Caroline.
Ashley.
Her voice was thick with tears. I just wanted to. I wanted to thank you for getting the charges dropped. You're welcome. And I wanted to apologize. Again. For everything. For the dinner party, for the way I've treated you, for today. Caroline, why did you try to steal those earrings? The question hung in the silence for a long moment. I don't know, she finally whispered. I saw them, and they were so beautiful, and I couldn't afford them. I haven't bought anything beautiful in weeks. And Jennifer and Susan were buying so many things, and they kept asking why I wasn't getting anything, and I felt so small. So, you decided to steal. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just wanted to feel normal again, like I belonged. The admission was heartbreaking in its honesty. Caroline had built her entire identity around material possessions, around the ability to keep up with her wealthy friends. Without my financial support, she was discovering that she had no idea who she was. Caroline, I said gently, you can't steal your way back to the life you used to have. I know that now. But, Ashley, I don't know how to be poor. I don't know how to live like this. You're not poor. You're just not rich. It feels the same. Then you need to learn the difference. And you need to learn to find your worth in something other than what you can afford to buy. How do I do that? I don't know. That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself. After I hung up, I sat in my bedroom for a long time, thinking about Caroline's question. How did someone who had spent their entire adult life defining themselves through material possessions learn to find meaning elsewhere? How did someone who had never worked, never struggled, never had to develop resilience suddenly acquire those skills in their 30s? I didn't know the answer. But I knew that continuing to shield her from the consequences of her choices wouldn't help her find it. The next morning brought a fresh crisis. Nathan called before 8 a.m., his voice tight with stress. Mom, the electricity was shut off yesterday. Did you forget to pay the bill? We couldn't afford to pay the bill. Caroline's paycheck barely covers groceries, and my salary goes to rent and the bare minimum. There's nothing left for utilities. I poured my coffee and walked to my study, looking out at my perfectly manicured gardens while my son described a life of constant financial pressure. What are you going to do? I don't know. The electric company wants a $500 deposit to turn it back on, plus the outstanding balance. We don't have it. Nathan, I can't. I'm not asking you to pay it. I needed to tell someone. Caroline's falling apart. She's talking about calling her parents. Caroline's parents lived in Ohio and had never approved of their daughter's marriage to Nathan. They were middle-class people who had watched their daughter marry into what they thought was wealth, only to discover that the wealth belonged to Nathan's mother and came with strings attached. Maybe that's not a bad idea, I said. Family support comes in many forms. Mom, if Caroline's parents find out what's happening, they'll want her to come home. They'll want her to leave me. And I love her. Despite everything, I love her. I don't want to lose my marriage because I can't provide for my wife. The pain in his voice was real, and it cut through my resolve like a knife. This was my son, the child I'd raised, the man I'd wanted to see succeed. Watching him struggle was harder than I'd anticipated. Nathan, I said carefully, what would you like me to say? I don't know. Maybe some advice? You built a successful business from nothing. You know how to make money. I know how to work hard and make smart decisions and live within my means while I'm building something. Those are skills you can learn.
But we need help now. Today.
We can't cook without electricity. We can't charge our phones. Caroline can't even dry her hair for work. Then you need to find a solution. Borrow from friends. Ask your boss for an advance. Sell something you own. Figure it out. We don't have anything left to sell, Mom. We sold Caroline's jewelry, most of her clothes, everything valuable we owned. There's nothing left. The image of Caroline selling her beloved possessions piece by piece should have moved me to pity. Instead, it reminded me of how many of those possessions had been purchased with my money, worn to events I'd paid for, displayed in a house I'd provided. Then you'll have to get creative, I said. People have been solving these problems for generations without wealthy relatives to bail them out. So that's it? You're just going to let us suffer? Nathan, you're not suffering. You're learning. There's a difference. I hung up before he could respond, but his words stayed with me all day. Let us suffer. As if the natural consequences of living beyond their means constituted some form of torture I was inflicting, rather than the logical result of choices they had made. That afternoon, I received a text from an unknown number. This is Susan Walsh. I wanted you to know that Caroline seemed very distressed yesterday at Saks. As her friend, I'm concerned. Is there anything I can do to help? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Caroline is learning to live within her means. It's an adjustment, but a necessary one. Thank you for your concern. Susan's response came quickly. If there's anything she needs, a meal, a ride, someone to talk to, please don't hesitate to ask. The offer was kind, and it reminded me that Caroline did have people who cared about her beyond her ability to afford expensive lunches and shopping trips. Perhaps that would be enough to see her through this transition. Or perhaps it wouldn't. Either way, it was no longer my responsibility to ensure her happiness. For the first time in 7 years, Caroline would have to find her own way, build her own support system, discover her own strength. It was what I should have encouraged years ago. It was what should have happened naturally as she grew into her 30s. But it had taken a dinner party insult and my own wounded pride to finally force the issue. Now we would all learn what Caroline Kell. The first sign that my social circle was beginning to understand the new dynamics came 3 days after Caroline's shoplifting incident, when Patricia Weatherby called to invite me to lunch. Just the two of us, she said, her voice carefully neutral. I thought it might be nice to catch up. Patricia and I had been acquaintances for 15 years, but we'd never lunched alone. Her sudden invitation could only mean one thing. She wanted to discuss Caroline's situation without seeming like she was gossiping. We met at the club on Friday afternoon, settling into a quiet corner table overlooking the golf course. Patricia ordered a salad and sparkling water, the lunch of someone who wanted to stay sharp for an important conversation. You look wonderful, Ashley, she began. That shade of blue is lovely on you. Thank you. How are Charles and the children? Oh, they're fine. Emma's wedding planning is consuming our lives, but that's to be expected. She paused, fidgeting with her napkin. Actually, Ashley, I wanted to talk to you about Caroline. Oh. Jennifer Morrison mentioned the incident at Saks, and I have to say, we're all quite concerned about her. I waited, letting Patricia navigate the delicate social waters of discussing someone else's misfortune. She seemed so different at your dinner party last month, Patricia continued. More aggressive, perhaps? And now this. We're wondering if she's having some kind of breakdown. The irony was rich. They were attributing Caroline's behavior to mental health issues rather than considering the simpler explanation that she was facing financial consequences for the first time in her adult life. Caroline is adjusting to some lifestyle changes, I said carefully. It's been challenging for her. Oh, good. So she's not. I mean, we were worried she might be having psychological problems. No psychological problems. Just learning to live within her means. Patricia's eyes widened slightly. This was clearly not the explanation she'd expected. Within her means? But I thought. I mean, with Nathan's position and your family situation. Nathan earns a good salary for a marketing manager, I said. It's enough to support a reasonable lifestyle. But the house they live in, they don't live there anymore. They've moved to an apartment that fits their budget. Patricia's fork paused halfway to her mouth. I could see her recalculating everything she thought she knew about my relationship with Nathan and Caroline. Ashley, she said slowly, are you saying that you've been helping them financially? I was helping them. I'm not anymore. The admission hung in the air between us like a revelation. Patricia set down her fork entirely, her lunch forgotten. For how long? 7 years. 7 years. She repeated the number as if she couldn't quite believe it. And now you've stopped? Completely. May I ask why? I considered how much to reveal. Patricia was a friend, but she was also part of a social network where information traveled quickly and stories grew in the telling. Caroline called me a leech, I said simply. At my own dinner party, in front of my guests. She thought it was amusing that I was supporting their lifestyle. Patricia's face went through a series of expressions: shock, understanding, and finally, indignation. She called you a what?
A leech. She asked how it felt to be such a leech.
Everyone laughed. Oh my God, Ashley. I was there. I remember the moment, but I thought it was just awkward dinner conversation. I had no idea she was talking about money. She was talking about the fact that I'd been paying their mortgage, their utilities, their credit cards, their car payments, everything, while she spent her days shopping and lunching and treating my generosity like an entitlement. Patricia stared at me for a long moment. And the shoplifting? Was the result of someone who has never learned to hear the word no, suddenly discovering that her credit cards don't work anymore. Ashley, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. None of us did. This was exactly what I'd hoped for. My friends needed to understand the real situation, needed to see Caroline's behavior in its proper context. For too long, Caroline had been viewed as Nathan's charming wife, the beautiful young woman who'd married into a prominent family. Now they would understand that she was actually a grown woman who'd been financially dependent on her mother-in-law while showing nothing but contempt for her benefactor. Well, Patricia said finally, this certainly explains a lot. Does it? The designer clothes, the expensive accessories, the fact that she never seemed to work but always had money to spend. I always wondered how Nathan afforded it all on his salary. He didn't. And Caroline never contributed financially? Caroline has never worked a day in her adult life. Until last week, when she got a part-time job at a boutique. Patricia absorbed this information with the expression of someone reassessing everything she thought she knew about a mutual acquaintance. What are you going to do now? She asked. Nothing. I've done quite enough already. But surely for Nathan's sake. Nathan is 35 years old. If he wants to support an unemployed wife with expensive tastes, that's his choice to make with his own money. When I got home that afternoon, I found Eleanor waiting in my living room with tea already prepared. My housekeeper had let her in, as she'd been doing for 20 years. How was lunch with Patricia? She asked without preamble. Illuminating. Word is spreading about Caroline's situation. Good. People need to know the truth. Eleanor poured my tea with the precision of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times. At 62, she moved with the grace of a woman who'd spent her life in social circles where every gesture mattered. I had an interesting call this morning, she continued, from Margaret Weatherby. Oh. She wanted to know if it would be appropriate to invite you to Emma's engagement party without including Nathan and Caroline. This was a significant development. In our social circle, married couples were typically invited as units. The fact that Margaret was considering separating us suggested that Caroline's reputation was already suffering serious damage. What did you tell her? I told her that your family dynamics were none of my business, but that you could certainly accept or decline invitations based on your own preferences. Diplomatic. I thought so. But Ashley, you should know that people are talking. And they're not talking kindly about Caroline. What are they saying? That she's been living off your generosity while treating you badly. That she's entitled and ungrateful. That she embarrassed herself and you at Saks. Eleanor sipped her tea thoughtfully. Jennifer Morrison is telling anyone who'll listen that Caroline seemed unhinged during the shopping trip. Apparently, she was acting strangely even before the theft attempt, talking about money constantly, making bitter comments about people who could afford things she wanted. It sounds like Caroline is having difficulty adjusting to reality. Indeed. But there's something else you should know. Yes. Caroline called me yesterday. This was unexpected. Caroline had never called Eleanor directly. Their relationship had always been cordial but distant. What did she want? She wanted to know if I thought you would forgive her eventually. If I thought this was a temporary punishment or a permanent change. And what did you tell her? I told her that you don't make idle threats, and that she might want to focus on building a life that doesn't depend on your financial support. How did she react? She cried, rather dramatically. Then she asked if I thought her marriage would survive this. What did you say to that? I told her that marriages survive all sorts of challenges when both people are committed to working together toward solutions rather than expecting someone else to solve their problems. Eleanor set down her teacup and fixed me with her sharp gaze. Ashley, there's something I need to say. Of course. I'm proud of you. The words caught me off guard. Proud. For years, I've watched you enable Caroline's worst impulses while she treated you with barely concealed contempt. I've bitten my tongue countless times when I wanted to tell you to stop being such a doormat. You never said anything, because you weren't ready to hear it. But watching you these past few weeks, the way you've handled this situation with such dignity and strength, it's reminded me of the woman you were before Julian died. Before you started trying to buy affection with your checkbook. The observation stung, because it was accurate. After Julian's death, I had retreated into generosity as a way of ensuring that people needed me. If I was indispensable, I wouldn't be abandoned. If I solved everyone's problems, they would love me. It had taken Caroline's cruelty to show me how backwards that thinking was. Do you think I'm being too harsh? I asked. I think you're being exactly as harsh as the situation requires. Caroline needed to learn that actions have consequences, and Nathan needed to learn that being a husband means providing for your wife, not expecting your mother to do it. That evening, I decided to test Eleanor's theory about my changing social status. I called Margaret Weatherby and asked if she'd like to have dinner the following week, just the two of us. Oh, Ashley, I'd love that, she said immediately. Actually, I've been meaning to call you. We're having a small dinner party next month, and I wanted to invite you. Just close friends. That sounds lovely. Wonderful. Should I send an invitation to Nathan and Caroline as well? The question was delicately posed, but the implication was clear. Margaret was giving me the option to attend social events without my son and daughter-in-law. I think this time it should just be me, I said. Nathan and Caroline are dealing with some personal matters right now. Of course. I understand completely. After I hung up, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in years, I was being invited to social events as Ashley Rashford, successful businesswoman, charming hostess, interesting companion, rather than as Nathan's mother who came with the burdensome appendage of his entitled wife. The freedom was intoxicating. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was having my coffee in the breakfast nook when Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door. She lived 3 houses down from Nathan and Caroline's old place and had been a casual acquaintance for years. Ashley, dear, she said when I invited her in, I hope you don't mind my dropping by, but I wanted to talk to you about what happened last week. The car repossession?
Yes.
I saw the whole thing from my kitchen window, and I have to say, it was quite the spectacle. Mrs. Henderson accepted my offer of coffee and settled into a chair. Caroline was making such a scene, crying and carrying on in her pajamas while the whole neighborhood watched. I imagine it was embarrassing for her. Oh, it was. But Ashley, what I really wanted to tell you is that several of us neighbors have been talking, and we think you're doing exactly the right thing. This surprised me. You do? Of course. For years, we've watched that girl treat you like her personal ATM while acting like she was better than everyone else. Do you know she once told my daughter that she didn't need to work because she had family money? I hadn't known that, but it fit the pattern. When was this? Last summer, at the neighborhood barbecue. My Sarah was talking about her job at the hospital, and Caroline made some comment about how nice it must be to feel useful, but that she was lucky enough not to need employment. She said that. Those exact words. And then she laughed, like it was amusing that some people had to work for a living. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward conspiratorially. Ashley, I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, and I've seen plenty of young couples struggle to make ends meet. But I've never seen anyone treat their benefactor with such disrespect. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Mrs. Henderson sharing various observations about Caroline's behavior over the years. The picture that emerged was of someone who had not only taken my generosity for granted, but had actively looked down on people who weren't fortunate enough to have wealthy relatives supporting them. After Mrs. Henderson left, I sat in my study thinking about perception versus reality. For 7 years, I had seen Caroline as thoughtless and entitled, but essentially harmless. Now I was discovering that her behavior had been noticed and criticized by people throughout our social circle. My friends and neighbors had been watching, judging, and waiting for me to finally stand up for myself. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Nathan's voice was strained when I answered. Mom, we have a problem. What kind of problem? Caroline was fired. I felt a familiar sinking sensation. From the boutique? Already? She's only been working there for a week. Apparently, she was rude to several customers. And she was caught using her employee discount to buy clothes we can't afford, then returning them the next day for cash. The behavior was both predictable and pathetic. Caroline had tried to game the system at a minimum wage job, demonstrating that she still hadn't grasped the basic principles of honest work and living within one's means. What did the manager say? That Caroline seemed to think the rules didn't apply to her. That she acted like the job was beneath her dignity. Maybe it was. Mom, that's not helping. We need the income. Any income. Then Caroline will need to find another job. And this time, she'll need to approach it with the proper attitude. What if she can't find anything else? What if word gets around about why she was fired? Then she'll learn that reputation matters and that treating people badly has consequences. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Mom, I'm scared. The admission was raw and honest, and it cut through my resolve like a knife. This was my little boy, the child who'd come to me with every scraped knee and broken toy, now facing adult problems with no safety net. Scared of what, sweetheart? Of losing everything. The apartment, my marriage, my dignity. I'm working 60 hours a week between my regular job and freelance work, and it's still not enough. Caroline's falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it. Maybe you can't fix it. Maybe Caroline needs to fix herself. But what if she can't? What if this breaks her completely? It was a valid question, and one I'd been avoiding. What if Caroline truly wasn't capable of adapting to life without my financial support? What if removing that support didn't teach her independence, but simply destroyed her? Nathan, I said carefully, what do you think would happen if I resumed paying your bills tomorrow? We'd be okay. We could move back to the house. Caroline could quit looking for work, and things could go back to normal. And how long do you think it would be before Caroline made another comment about leeches? Before she took my generosity for granted again? Before she decided that humiliating me in public was acceptable because she knew I'd keep paying either way? Nathan was silent. I can't go back to being treated like an A-team, I continued. And you can't go back to being a 35-year-old man whose mother pays his bills. It's not healthy for any of us. So what do we do? You keep working. Caroline finds another job and learns to treat it with respect. You both learn to live on what you actually earn instead of what you think you deserve. And you figure out how to be married to each other instead of being married to my bank account. After I hung up, I found myself thinking about the first time Nathan had brought Caroline home. She'd been 24 then, recently graduated from college with a degree in art history and no particular career goals. She'd been charming and beautiful and seemingly smitten with my son. I'd welcomed her warmly, eager to see Nathan happy after a string of failed relationships. When had things gone wrong? When had my desire to help them get started turned into an expectation that I would support them indefinitely? When had Caroline's gratitude transformed into entitlement and Nathan's appreciation become dependence? Maybe it had been gradual, so slow that none of us noticed it happening. Maybe it had been the result of good intentions on all sides. My desire to be generous, their desire to provide Caroline with security and comfort, Caroline's desire to live up to the lifestyle she thought came with marrying into my family. But intentions didn't matter now. What mattered was that I had created a situation where two adults in their 30s had never learned to be financially responsible, and where my generosity had become a source of resentment rather than gratitude. Breaking that pattern was going to be painful for all of us, but continuing it would have been worse. That evening, Eleanor called with news. "I've been invited to 3 different dinner parties in the past 2 days," she said without preamble. "Congratulations." "Ashley, these are people who want to discuss your situation without seeming like gossips. Everyone's talking about what you've done, and the consensus is overwhelmingly supportive." "Really? Really?" "Patricia Weatherby told Margaret Morrison that you were finally standing up for yourself. Margaret told Susan Walsh that it was about time someone held Caroline accountable. Susan told Jennifer Morrison that she'd always thought Caroline was entitled and ungrateful. And what did Jennifer say? That she'd witnessed Caroline's breakdown at Saks and that it was clear the girl had never faced real adversity in her life." Eleanor paused. "Ashley, do you realize what's happening? People are gossiping about my family drama. People are realizing that you've been taken advantage of for years, and they're admiring your strength in finally putting a stop to it. You're not being seen as the villain in this story. Caroline is." This was better than I'd hoped. In our social circle, perception was everything. If people understood that I was the wronged party rather than the cruel mother-in-law, it would make everything easier. "There's something else," Eleanor continued. "Charles Montgomery wants to discuss a business opportunity with you. Apparently, he's been impressed by how you've handled this situation, and he thinks you might be interested in investing in a new development project." "Business is good," I said. "Personal drama shouldn't interfere with professional opportunities." That's exactly what Charles said. He mentioned that he'd always respected your business acumen, but that watching you handle this family situation had shown him a level of strength and decisiveness that made him want to work with you. After Eleanor and I finished talking, I walked through my house, appreciating the peace and beauty that surrounded me. Fresh flowers in every room, art that I'd chosen because I loved it, furniture that reflected my taste rather than someone else's demands. For the first time in years, my home felt entirely mine again. Tomorrow, I would resume my normal schedule of property showings and business meetings. I would have lunch with friends who valued my company rather than my checkbook. I would make decisions. Caroline and Nathan would face another day of financial stress, job hunting, and reality. They would learn to budget and compromise and make difficult choices. They would discover what they were really made of when they couldn't depend on my resources to solve their problems. It wasn't what I'd planned when I'd first welcomed Caroline into our family, but I was beginning to understand what should have happened years ago. The social freeze-out was just beginning, and I found that I didn't mind the cold at all. The call came at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November. I was in my kitchen making coffee when my phone rang, Nathan's name flashing on the screen. Calls that early were never good news. Nathan? What's wrong?
Mom.
His voice was thick with exhaustion and something that sounded like defeat. We got the foreclosure notice yesterday. I set down my coffee cup and sank into a chair at my breakfast table. I'd known this was coming. Trent had warned me about the timeline, but hearing it from Nathan made it real in a way that paperwork hadn't. How long do you have? 30 days. Maybe 60 if we can prove we're making an effort to catch up on payments, but... He laughed bitterly. We can't even make the current payment, let alone catch up on 3 months of missed ones. Where's Caroline? Still sleeping. She's been sleeping a lot lately. 14, 15 hours a day. I think she's depressed. Or in denial, I thought but didn't say. Caroline had always retreated from unpleasant realities, and the complete collapse of her lifestyle would certainly qualify. Have you talked to a lawyer about your options? We can't afford a lawyer, Mom. We can barely afford groceries. Nathan's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and I felt the familiar tug of maternal instinct. Every fiber of my being wanted to write a check, to make this problem disappear, to restore peace to my son's life. But I also remembered Caroline's laughter at my dinner party, her casual cruelty, her absolute certainty that she could treat me badly, without consequences. What are your plans? I don't know. Caroline keeps saying you'll change your mind, that you'll come around before we actually lose the house. She's convinced this is all temporary. It's not temporary, Nathan. I know that. But she won't listen to me. She keeps talking about how you've always been there for us before, how you wouldn't actually let us become homeless. You won't be homeless. You'll just need to find housing you can actually afford. Do you know what we can afford on my salary? After taxes, after health insurance, after my student loans? Maybe $800 a month. Do you know what kind of place you can rent for $800 a month in this city? I did know, actually. As a real estate developer, I was intimately familiar with housing costs at every price point. $800 would get them a one-bedroom apartment in a marginal neighborhood, probably without amenities like in-unit laundry or parking. It's a starting point, I said. You can work up from there. Mom, Caroline has never lived anywhere without granite countertops. She's never shared a bathroom with neighbors or done laundry in a basement. This is going to destroy her. Or it's going to teach her resilience. What if it doesn't? What if she just breaks? The question haunted me long after Nathan hung up. What if Caroline truly couldn't adapt? What if removing my financial support didn't create independence, but simply caused a complete psychological collapse? I was still wrestling with these thoughts when Eleanor arrived for our weekly breakfast. She took one look at my face and poured herself coffee without waiting for an invitation. Bad news, she asked. The foreclosure notice came through.
Ah.
How's Nathan handling it? About as well as you'd expect. He's panicking, Caroline's in denial, and they both seem to think I'm going to rescue them at the last minute. Eleanor studied me over her coffee cup. Are you?
No.
You sound uncertain. I sighed. I keep thinking about Caroline sleeping 15 hours a day. About Nathan working 60 hours a week and still failing. About the possibility that I'm not teaching them independence. I'm just destroying them. Ashley, Eleanor said gently, what would you tell a friend who came to you with this same situation? I'd tell her that enabling destructive behavior doesn't help anyone, and that real love sometimes requires letting people face consequences. And I'd remind her that she can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. Eleanor nodded approvingly.
Exactly.
Caroline doesn't want to learn to live within her means. She wants you to continue funding her lifestyle. Nathan doesn't want to figure out how to support his wife on his own income. He wants you to keep solving that problem for him. But what if they really can't manage without my help? Then they'll learn to ask for help from appropriate sources. Social services, if necessary. Caroline's parents. Nathan's employer might offer assistance or advancement opportunities. There are resources available to people who truly need them. And if those resources aren't enough, then they'll make the same difficult choices that millions of other people make every day. They'll downsize, they'll sacrifice, they'll work harder, they'll find roommates, they'll shop at thrift stores and eat pasta for dinner and learn that survival is possible even when life isn't luxurious. Eleanor reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Ashley, you're not responsible for protecting two adults from the natural consequences of their choices. You never were. That afternoon, I had a property showing for a downtown loft that had been converted from an old warehouse. The space was beautiful, exposed brick walls, soaring ceilings, modern amenities, and the young couple viewing it was clearly excited. "We love it," the woman said, running her hand along the granite kitchen island. "But the price. It's a significant investment," I agreed. "But look at the location, the craftsmanship, the potential for appreciation." "We'd be stretching ourselves pretty thin," the man admitted. "Pretty much living paycheck to paycheck for the first few years." "That's not uncommon for first-time buyers," I said. "Most people start with a stretch purchase and grow into it." But even as I said the words, I was thinking about Nathan and Caroline, who had started with my money and never grown into financial responsibility. There was a difference between stretching to afford something you earned and depending on someone else to provide what you couldn't pay for yourself. "We'll need to think about it," the woman said. "Of course. Take your time. But remember, you can't wait forever for the perfect financial situation. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to build the life you want." After they left, I stood alone in the empty loft, looking out at the city's skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. This was what I'd built my business on, helping people make smart investments in their futures, taking reasonable risks to achieve their goals. But somehow, with Nathan and Caroline, I'd done the opposite. I'd removed all risk from their lives, eliminating the possibility of both failure and genuine success. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Rashford, this is Caroline. I know you're angry with me, but please don't let Nathan lose his childhood home. I'm begging you." The message was followed by another. "I'll do anything. Get a better job, apologize publicly, whatever you want. Just please don't let us lose everything." I stared at the messages for a long time. Caroline still didn't understand that the house had never been Nathan's. It had been mine, and I'd allowed them to live in it. She still thought in terms of what I would let happen, as if I were choosing to punish them rather than simply refusing to continue enabling them. I typed back, "Caroline, I'm not taking anything away from you. I'm simply no longer paying for things you can't afford. There's a difference." Her response came immediately. "But where will we live? What will we do?" "You'll figure it out. Most people do. I don't know how to live like this. I've never been poor." "You're not poor. You're just not rich. Learn the difference." She didn't respond after that, and I was grateful for the silence. That evening, I met Trent for dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. Over wine and perfectly prepared salmon, we discussed my portfolio and several investment opportunities. It was a relief to focus on business instead of family drama. "How are you holding up?" he asked over dessert. "Better than I expected, actually. I thought I'd feel more guilty." "Any regrets?" "About cutting them off?"
No.
"About letting it go on for so long?" "Absolutely." Trent nodded. "I've seen this situation before. Wealthy parents or grandparents who mean well, but end up creating dependent adults who never learn to function independently. What usually happens? One of two things. Either the dependent family members learn to stand on their own feet and develop real strength and resilience, or they find another enabler to take over the role." "Another enabler?" "Caroline's parents, for instance. Or Nathan might pressure you into resuming support by threatening divorce or some other emotional manipulation." I considered this. Nathan wouldn't manipulate me. Maybe not consciously, but desperate people do desperate things. And Caroline certainly seems capable of manipulation. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang. Nathan's name appeared on the screen. "Excuse me," I told Trent and answered the call. "Mom, thank God you picked up. Caroline's in the emergency room." My blood ran cold. "What happened? Is she hurt?" "She took sleeping pills. A lot of them." "She's okay," he added quickly, "but the doctors want to keep her overnight for observation." Was it? I couldn't finish the question. Intentional? I don't know. She says she just wanted to sleep, that she couldn't stand being awake anymore. But the amount she took. His voice broke.
Mom, I'm scared.
Really scared. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of every decision I'd made over the past 2 months. Which hospital? St. Mary's. But Mom, you don't have to come. I needed to tell someone. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I hung up and looked at Trent, who was watching me with concern. "Family emergency," I said. "I have to go." "Of course. Is there anything I can do?" "Pray that I haven't made a terrible mistake." The drive to the hospital seemed to take forever, my mind racing through possibilities. Had Caroline actually tried to hurt herself, or was this an accident born of desperation and poor judgment? Either way, I felt the crushing weight of responsibility. Had my refusal to continue enabling them pushed Caroline to this point? I found Nathan in the emergency room waiting area, still wearing his work clothes, his hair disheveled and his face gray with exhaustion and fear. "How is she?" I asked, sitting beside him. "Stable. They pumped her stomach and she's sleeping now. The psychiatrist wants to evaluate her in the morning." "What did she take?" "Ambien. An entire bottle of 30 pills." Nathan rubbed his face with his hands. "She's been having trouble sleeping since we got the foreclosure notice. The doctor prescribed them last week, and tonight she said she just wanted to sleep until all of this was over." "Nathan, did she mean to?" "I don't know, Mom. I honestly don't know. She's been so different these past few months. Like she's disappearing a little more each day." We sat in silence for several minutes, surrounded by the sounds of the hospital, beeping machines, hushed conversations, the soft squeak of shoes on linoleum floors. "This is my fault," I said finally. "No, it's not. If I hadn't cut off the money—" "Mom." Nathan turned to face me, and I was shocked by how much older he looked. The past 2 months had aged him years. "This isn't your fault. Caroline's inability to handle adversity isn't your responsibility. But if I'd handled things differently, you'd still be enabling a grown woman who thinks the world owes her a luxury lifestyle. And I'd still be a 35-year-old man whose mother pays his bills." Nathan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "Do you know what I realized tonight, watching them pump my wife's stomach because she couldn't handle the idea of living in a normal apartment?" I shook my head. "That I don't actually know who Caroline is when she's not spending your money. I've been married to her for 8 years, and I have no idea what she's like when she has to work for what she wants, or cope with disappointment, or figure out how to be happy without constant material comfort. And I'm starting to think maybe I should find out before I spend the rest of my life with her." The admission hung between us like a confession. For the first time since this whole situation had begun, Nathan was questioning not just their financial arrangement, but their entire relationship. "Nathan, I love her, Mom, but I'm not sure I like who she becomes when she can't have everything she wants. And I'm definitely not sure I can build a life with someone who'd rather sleep for 15 hours than look for a job." A doctor appeared in the doorway, a young woman in scrubs who looked like she'd been working for 20 hours straight. "Mr. Keller, your wife is awake and asking for you." Nathan stood up, then paused. "Mom, will you come with me?" I wanted to say no, wanted to avoid seeing Caroline in her current state, wanted to maintain the emotional distance I'd worked so hard to establish. But Nathan needed me, and despite everything that had happened, he was still my son. Of course. Caroline was lying in a hospital bed, connected to various monitors, looking pale and fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Ashley," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." I sat in the chair beside her bed while Nathan took her hand. "How are you feeling?" "Stupid. Ashamed. Scared." She looked directly at me. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to. I just wanted everything to stop hurting for a while." "Caroline, you could have died." "I know. I know that now." The doctor explained how dangerous it was. She wiped her eyes with a tissue. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be poor. I don't know how to live without beautiful things, or how to work at jobs I hate, or how to be married to Nathan when we're stressed about money all the time. So you learn. What if I can't? What if I'm just not built for this kind of life? It was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer. Then you'll have to decide what's more important, your marriage or your comfort. Nathan's love or financial security. Building something real together or waiting for someone else to provide what you think you deserve. Caroline closed her eyes. The psychiatrist says I need to stay here for a few days. For evaluation and to figure out how to cope with things differently. That sounds like a good idea. Ashley? Caroline's voice was very small. Do you think I'm a terrible person? I looked at this young woman who had shared my son's life for 8 years, who had lived in luxury while treating me with contempt, who had called me a leech in front of my friends and then expected me to continue funding her lifestyle. I thought about her entitled attitude, her complete inability to handle adversity, her willingness to manipulate situations to get what she wanted. But I also saw someone who was genuinely lost, who had never learned the skills she needed to build a meaningful life, who was facing her own limitations for the first time. I think you're someone who's never been challenged before, I said finally. And I think you have the opportunity now to find out what you're really capable of. What if I'm not capable of anything? Then you'll learn to be. People are remarkably adaptable when they have to be. Caroline nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked like she might be listening. Nathan and I left the hospital together around midnight. In the parking lot, he turned to me with exhaustion written across his features. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." "Okay. Do you think Caroline and I have a chance? Without your money, without the lifestyle we're used to, do you think we can make this work?" I studied my son's face in the dim light of the parking lot. He'd been forced to grow up considerably over the past few months, and I could see new lines of maturity around his eyes. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I think you're both about to find out who you really are when you can't depend on external support. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And if it turns out we're not compatible when we're struggling, then you'll have learned something important about yourselves and your relationship. Either way, you'll be dealing with reality instead of living in an artificial situation that I was creating and maintaining." Nathan nodded slowly. "Thank you for coming tonight. You're my son. I'll always come when you really need me." "I know. And Mom, I'm starting to understand the difference between needing you and using you." I hugged him then. This man who had once been my little boy, who was finally learning to stand on his own feet even as his world collapsed around him. As I drove home through empty streets, I thought about Caroline lying in that hospital bed, finally confronting the reality of her situation. Maybe this crisis would be the wake-up call she needed. Maybe she would emerge from the hospital with a new understanding of what really mattered in life. Or maybe she would continue to be someone who couldn't function without constant external support, in which case Nathan would have to decide whether he wanted to spend his life taking care of someone who couldn't take care of herself. Either way, the house of cards had finally collapsed completely. What rose from the rubble would be up to them. Caroline spent 4 days in the psychiatric unit at St. Mary's Hospital. During that time, I found myself in the unexpected position of managing Nathan's emotional crisis while maintaining my resolve not to resume financial support. He called me every evening with updates. Caroline was working with a therapist who specialized in adjustment disorders. She was attending group sessions with other patients learning to cope with major life changes. She was, according to Nathan, starting to understand some things about herself. On Friday afternoon, he called with different news. "Mom, Caroline's being discharged tomorrow morning. But there's something else. She wants to talk to you. Alone." "Nathan, I don't think that's a good idea."
Please. She's different, Mom.
"Something changed while she was in there. She's not the same person who went into the hospital." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet Caroline for coffee the day after her discharge. We met at a small cafe downtown, far from our usual haunts in the upscale part of the city. Caroline was already seated when I arrived, and I was struck by how different she looked. Gone were the designer clothes and perfect hair. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, both clearly from discount stores. Her hair was pulled back in a plain ponytail, and she wore no makeup except a touch of lipstick. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked like a normal person rather than a carefully curated image. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. "How are you feeling?" "Better."
Clearer.
Caroline wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Ashley, I need to tell you some things. Things I figured out while I was in the hospital." I waited, curious despite myself. "First, I owe you an apology that goes way beyond what I said at your dinner party. I owe you an apology for 8 years of taking your generosity for granted, for treating you like an ATM, for never once considering what my attitude was costing you emotionally." This was a more thoughtful apology than I'd expected. "Go on." "The therapist helped me understand that I've been living my entire adult life as if I were entitled to luxury without earning it. I convinced myself that because I was pretty, because I married Nathan, because you could afford it, that I deserved to have everything paid for." Caroline took a sip of her coffee, her hands shaking slightly. "But the truth is, I never deserved any of it. You were incredibly generous to us, and instead of being grateful, I became resentful when your generosity came with expectations of basic respect. What else did you figure out? That I've never actually accomplished anything in my life. I graduated from college, but I chose a major that wouldn't lead to employment because I assumed I'd never need to work. I married Nathan, but I never learned to be a true partner because I expected him, and you, to take care of me like I was a child." This level of self-awareness was startling. The Caroline I'd known had never shown any capacity for this kind of honest self-reflection. "The hardest thing to accept," she continued, "is that I don't actually know who I am when I'm not defining myself by what I can afford to buy. I don't know what I'm good at, what I enjoy, what I want from life beyond material comfort. And what are you going to do about that?" "I'm going to find out. I got a job yesterday." "Doing what?" "Working at a nonprofit that helps women transition back into the workforce after extended unemployment. It doesn't pay much, but the work is meaningful, and they're willing to train me." This was genuinely surprising. The Caroline I'd known had shown no interest in helping anyone, let alone other women facing career challenges. "That sounds like a good fit." "I hope so." "I start Monday." Caroline leaned forward slightly. "Ashley, I need you to know that I'm not here to ask you to change your mind about the money. I understand now that continuing to support us would actually hurt Nathan and me in the long run." "Then why did you want to meet?" "Because I wanted you to know that I finally understand what you were trying to teach us. And because I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" "For refusing to enable my destructive behavior any longer. For forcing me to confront who I really am instead of who I pretended to be. For loving Nathan enough to let him struggle instead of protecting him from reality." Caroline's eyes filled with tears, but she continued speaking. I spent 4 days in that hospital with women who were dealing with real problems: domestic violence, addiction, mental illness, poverty. And I realized that my biggest problem was that I'd never had any real problems. How is Nathan handling all of this? He's been incredible. Supportive, but honest. He told me yesterday that he fell in love with me when I was 24 and ambitious and full of dreams, and that he's been wondering for years where that person went. Where did she go? She got comfortable. She decided that being taken care of was easier than building something herself. She forgot that accomplishment feels better than acquisition. Caroline reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped package. I have something for you. I opened it to find a simple silver bracelet, clearly inexpensive, probably from a department store. Caroline, you didn't need to. It's the first thing I've bought with money I actually earned. From my job at the boutique, before I got fired for being awful to customers. She smiled ruefully. I wanted you to have something that represents who I'm trying to become instead of who I used to be. I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist. It was simple and pretty, and it meant more to me than any of the expensive gifts Caroline had given me over the years, gifts purchased with my own money. Thank you. There's something else I need to tell you. Nathan and I are getting divorced. The statement hit me like a physical blow. Caroline, no. You don't have to. It's not about the money, Ashley. It's about the fact that we've never actually been married to each other. We've been married to the lifestyle you provided. Nathan deserves a wife who can be his partner instead of his dependent. And I need to learn who I am when I'm not trying to be someone's perfect accessory. Are you sure? The therapist helped me understand that I've been using marriage as a way to avoid growing up. I went from my parents' house to college to Nathan's life without ever having to figure out how to take care of myself. I'm 32 years old, and I've never lived alone, never supported myself, never made a decision without considering what someone else wanted me to do. And Nathan agrees with this? Nathan suggested it, actually. He said he loves me, but he's not sure he knows me well enough to stay married to me. We both need time to figure out who we are as individuals before we can decide if we want to be together as a couple. I felt a complex mix of emotions: sadness for the end of their marriage, relief that they were making mature decisions, and something that might have been pride in how much Caroline had grown in just a few days. Where will you live? I'm moving in with my sister in Ohio while I get back on my feet. She's got a spare room, and I can help with her kids while I figure out what I want to do long term. And Nathan? He's found a studio apartment he can afford on his own. He seems relieved, actually, like a weight has been lifted. We talked for another hour, and I was continually amazed by the change in Caroline. The entitled, shallow woman I'd known had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely interested in growth and self-improvement. It was as if the hospital stay had stripped away years of accumulated selfishness and revealed the person she might have been all along. As we prepared to leave, Caroline reached across the table and took my hand. Ashley, I know I have no right to ask this, but I hope someday you'll be proud of the person I become. I hope you'll see that your refusal to keep enabling me was the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me. I hope so too, Caroline. And I hope that Nathan and I can both find our way back to your dinner table someday, not as dependents, but as adults you can respect. After Caroline left, I sat alone in the cafe for a long time, processing what had just happened. The vindictive part of me had wanted Caroline to suffer for her years of taking advantage of my generosity. But watching her genuine transformation, seeing her take responsibility for her behavior and make difficult but necessary changes, was far more satisfying than any revenge could have been. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. Lunch tomorrow? I have news. Of course. Your place or mine?
Mine. I'm cooking.
Eleanor never cooked unless she had something significant to discuss. I spent the rest of the evening wondering what news could be important enough to warrant homemade soup and fresh bread. I arrived at Eleanor's house the next day to find her in an excellent mood, humming as she arranged flowers in her dining room. "You seem pleased about something," I observed. "Several things, actually. Sit down, darling. We have much to discuss." Over lunch, Eleanor filled me in on the latest developments in our social circle. "First," she said, "Patricia Weatherby has been singing your praises to anyone who'll listen. Apparently, she's been telling people that your handling of the Caroline situation shows remarkable strength and wisdom. That's kind of her. More than kind, it's strategic. Patricia has considerable social influence, and her endorsement of your actions is shaping how others view the situation." Eleanor paused to butter her bread. "Second, Margaret Morrison has asked me to feel you out about joining the board of the Art Museum. She says they need someone with your business acumen and social grace." This was unexpected. Board positions at the museum were highly coveted and rarely offered to people who hadn't specifically lobbied for them. That's quite an honor. It's more than that, it's recognition. Margaret specifically mentioned that they were impressed by how you'd handled your family situation with such dignity. And third, Eleanor smiled. "I've been asked to plan a dinner party in your honor." "In my honor? For what?" "For being an inspiration to other women who've been taken advantage of by family members. Apparently, your story has resonated with quite a few people who've been struggling with similar situations." I stared at Eleanor in amazement. People want to honor me for cutting off my son and daughter-in-law. People want to honor you for refusing to enable destructive behavior, for prioritizing your own dignity over false peace, and for demonstrating that love sometimes requires saying no. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes bright with satisfaction. "Ashley, do you realize what's happened? You've gone from being seen as Caroline's benefactor to being recognized as a woman of principle who refused to be taken advantage of. Your social standing has actually improved since you stopped paying their bills." It was true. Over the past few months, I'd received more invitations, more business opportunities, and more genuine respect than I had in years. By refusing to continue being Caroline's ATM, I'd inadvertently reminded people that I was Ashley Rashford, successful businesswoman, gracious hostess, and woman of substance, rather than simply the wealthy mother-in-law who funded her son's lifestyle. "There's something else," Eleanor continued. "Something I've been hesitant to mention."
What?
"Charles Montgomery has been asking about you. Personal questions." Charles Montgomery was a successful attorney, recently widowed after 40 years of marriage. He was intelligent, cultured, and exactly the kind of man I might have considered dating if I'd been thinking about such things. "What kind of personal questions?" "Whether you're happy being alone. Whether you'd be open to companionship. Whether you might enjoy dinner with someone who appreciates your independent spirit." I felt a flutter of something I hadn't experienced in years. Interest. Possibility. The idea that someone might find me attractive not because I could solve their problems or fund their lifestyle, but because I was worth knowing for myself. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him to ask you himself." That afternoon, I drove past Nathan and Caroline's old house, my former house, where a "for sale" sign now stood in the front yard. The new owners would probably be a young family, excited about their first luxury home, grateful for granite countertops and hardwood floors and all the beautiful details that Caroline had taken for granted. I felt no sadness looking at it. The house had been a symbol of my enabling, a beautiful prison where I'd kept my son and daughter-in-law comfortable while preventing them from growing up. Letting it go had been necessary for all of us. My phone rang as I was driving home. Nathan's name appeared on the screen.
"Hey, Sua."
"How are you?" "I'm good, Mom. Really good, actually. I wanted to tell you about my new apartment." "Oh, it's tiny. Just a studio, but it's mine. I mean, I'm paying for it with money I actually earned. Do you know how strange that feels? I'm 35 years old, And this is the first place I've ever lived that I paid for myself. How does it feel? Scary. Liberating. Like I'm finally growing up. Nathan paused. Mom, I need to thank you. For what? For refusing to rescue me. For letting me figure out how to take care of myself. For loving me enough to let me struggle. Nathan, I know it was hard for you. I know every instinct you had was telling you to write a check and make the problems go away. But if you had, I'd still be a dependent child instead of becoming the man I should have been all along. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. I'm starting to be proud of myself. And Mom, I'm going to pay you back. Nathan, you don't owe me. Not the money. Well, eventually the money too, but that's not what I mean. I'm going to become the kind of son you can be proud of. The kind of man who adds value to your life instead of just taking from it. After Nathan hung up, I sat in my car for several minutes, overwhelmed by the realization that my painful decision had worked exactly as intended. Nathan was learning to be self-sufficient. Caroline was finally growing up, and I was rediscovering who I was when I wasn't defined by my role as everyone's financial savior. That evening, Charles Montgomery called. Ashley, I hope you don't mind my reaching out directly. Eleanor suggested I should speak to you myself rather than working through intermediaries. Not at all, Charles. What can I do for you? I was wondering if you might be free for dinner next week. I know we've known each other socially for years, but I'd love the opportunity to get to know you better as an individual rather than as part of a crowd. I found myself smiling. I'd like that very much. Wonderful. I should mention that I find your recent handling of your family situation quite admirable. It takes real strength to prioritize principle over peace. Thank you. I hope you don't mind my saying so, but I've always been attracted to women of substance. Women who know their own worth and refuse to compromise their values for the sake of avoiding conflict. After we finalized our dinner plans, I walked through my house with new eyes. For the first time in 7 years, this space was entirely mine again. No one else's problems to solve, no one else's lifestyle to fund, no one else's poor choices to enable. I was Ashley Rashford, 59 years old, financially successful, socially respected, and finally free to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. The coup de grace hadn't been a single devastating blow to Caroline and Nathan. It had been the gradual revelation that I didn't need to be needed in order to be valued. I didn't need to solve everyone's problems in order to be loved. I didn't need to enable destructive behavior in order to maintain family harmony. The most satisfying revenge had been discovering that I was worth more than my checkbook, both to myself and to the people who truly mattered. 1 year later, I stood in my living room, adjusting the fresh white orchids in their silver vases and surveying the table set for 12. The anniversary dinner had become something of a tradition. Exactly 1 year after the dinner party that changed everything, I was hosting another elegant gathering for my closest friends. But everything was different now. The guest list, for starters, was entirely composed of people who valued my company rather than my financial support. Eleanor, of course, looking radiant in sapphire blue. Patricia and Margaret, who had become genuine friends rather than mere social acquaintances. Charles Montgomery, who had evolved from dinner companion to something approaching a romantic partnership over the past 8 months. And Nathan. He'd asked if he could attend, not as my dependent son, but as an independent adult who wanted to celebrate how far we'd all come. I'd been delighted to include him, partly because I was proud of the man he'd become, and partly because his presence would provide a lovely contrast to the bitter young man who'd attended last year's dinner. Ashley, you look stunning, Eleanor said, kissing my cheek as she arrived. That emerald green is absolutely perfect on you. Thank you, darling. Charles helped me pick it out. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Charles is shopping with you now? How delightfully domestic. He has excellent taste. And he enjoys being helpful without being controlling. What a novel concept. The guests arrived in their usual fashionably late manner, and I found myself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of hosting. But there was an ease to this gathering that had been missing from my parties for years. No one was performing for my benefit, hoping to maintain their access to my generosity. No one was walking on eggshells, afraid that conflict might affect their financial security. These people genuinely liked me, and I genuinely liked them. I realized, what social gatherings were supposed to feel like. Nathan arrived precisely on time, looking handsome and confident in a suit he bought with his own money. The past year had been transformative for him. He'd been promoted twice at work, had started a successful consulting business on the side, and carried himself with the dignity of a man who'd earned his own way in the world. "Mom, the house looks incredible," he said, hugging me warmly. "Thank you for including me tonight. Thank you for becoming someone worth including." He laughed. Direct as always. "I love that about you." Over cocktails, the conversation flowed naturally from business to travel to local politics. Charles regaled us with stories from his recent case involving a celebrity divorce, while Patricia updated us on her daughter's wedding plans. Eleanor entertained the table with her observations about the art world's latest scandals. I felt a deep sense of contentment that had been missing from my life for years. This was what I'd been seeking all along: genuine connection, mutual respect, and the pleasure of bringing together people who enhanced each other's lives. When dinner was announced, we moved to the dining room, where Chef Marcus had outdone himself with a menu designed around seasonal ingredients and elegant presentation. As we settled into our seats, I couldn't help but think about the last time we'd all gathered in this room. "A toast," Charles said, raising his wine glass as the first course was served. "To Ashley, for demonstrating that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's destructive behavior." Here, Eleanor agreed. "And to the strength it takes to prioritize principle over peace." The toast was warm and genuine, and I felt a flush of pleasure at being recognized for qualities beyond my bank account. These people respected my decision-making, my integrity, my refusal to be taken advantage of. It was profoundly satisfying. "I have an announcement," Nathan said during the main course. "I wanted you all to know that I've finally saved enough money to start paying Mom back for some of the support she provided over the years." This was news to me. "Nathan, that's not necessary." "It's absolutely necessary. Not because you're demanding it, but because it's the right thing to do. I spent 7 years living off your generosity while taking it for granted. The least I can do is acknowledge that debt and work to repay it." "How much are we talking about?" Eleanor asked with characteristic directness. "A lot," Nathan admitted. "More than I initially realized. But I've set up a payment plan that will allow me to pay Mom back over the next 10 years while still maintaining my independence." "That's quite a commitment," Charles observed approvingly. "It's quite a debt. But it feels good to finally take responsibility for it." I was genuinely moved by Nathan's gesture. Not because I needed the money, but because it represented his complete transformation from dependent child to responsible adult. "There's something else," Nathan continued. "I've been in touch with Caroline." This caught everyone's attention. Caroline had become something of a mythical figure in our social circle, the cautionary tale of what happened when entitlement met reality. "How is she?" I asked, surprised by my genuine curiosity. "She's doing well. Really well, actually. She's been promoted to program coordinator at the nonprofit where she works. She's dating someone, a teacher she met in Ohio. And she's saving money to go back to school for a master's degree in social work." Social work. Eleanor sounded skeptical. Apparently, her experience with financial crisis and mental health treatment gave her insight into how to help other people facing similar challenges. She's found her calling in helping women transition back into the workforce after extended unemployment. I felt a complex mix of emotions hearing this news. Pride, perhaps, that Caroline had found meaningful work, satisfaction that she'd learned to define herself through accomplishment rather than acquisition, and something that might have been affection for the woman she'd become. "She asked me to give you a message," Nathan said, looking directly at me. "Oh." "She said to tell you that she thinks about that last conversation you had, the one where you told her she needed to find her worth in something other than what she could afford to buy. She said it changed her life." "I'm glad to hear it. She also said that someday, when she's built something she's truly proud of, she'd like to write you a proper letter of thanks. Not asking for anything, not trying to rebuild a relationship, just acknowledging what your refusal to enable her ultimately gave her." The conversation moved on to other topics, but I found myself thinking about Caroline throughout the evening. The spoiled, entitled woman I'd known had apparently transformed into someone who helped other women overcome their own challenges. It was more than I'd dared to hope for when I'd cut off her financial support. After dinner, as we moved back to the living room for coffee and dessert, Eleanor pulled me aside. "How does it feel?" she asked quietly. "How does what feel?" "Being right. Knowing that your decision to stop enabling them led to exactly the kind of growth and independence you'd hoped for." I considered the question seriously. Satisfying, but also humbling. I spent so many years convinced that my financial support was helping them, when really it was preventing them from becoming the people they were capable of being. And now I know the difference between helping and enabling, between love and control, between being needed and being valued. Eleanor smiled. "And you're being courted by a distinguished gentleman who appreciates your strength rather than your bank account." I glanced across the room at Charles, who was deep in conversation with Nathan about investment strategies. At 71, he was silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from a life well lived. More importantly, he was financially independent, intellectually stimulating, and attracted to me for who I was rather than what I could provide. "It's nice to be appreciated for my mind instead of my checkbook," I admitted. "And your beauty, don't forget. You're absolutely glowing these days." It was true. The stress of managing other people's financial crises, the resentment of being taken for granted, the exhaustion of constantly solving problems that weren't mine, all of that had lifted over the past year. I felt younger, more energetic, more myself than I had in ages. As the evening wound down and guests began making their departures, Nathan was among the last to leave. "Mom," he said as I walked him to the door, "thank you for tonight. And thank you for everything you've done this past year." "I haven't done anything this past year. That's rather the point." He laughed. "You've done the hardest thing a parent can do. You've let your child struggle and grow instead of protecting them from reality. It took tremendous strength. It took tremendous selfishness, actually. I was tired of being treated like an AT. Maybe. But the result was that you gave me the chance to become the man I should have been all along. And you gave Caroline the chance to discover who she really was underneath all that entitlement." Nathan hugged me tightly. "I love you, Mom. Not because of what you can do for me, but because of who you are." After everyone had gone home, I sat in my living room with a glass of wine, surrounded by the detritus of a successful dinner party. Crystal glasses waiting to be washed, plates to be cleared, flowers that would need fresh water in the morning. But instead of feeling tired, I felt energized. This was my life now, filled with genuine relationships, meaningful work, and the freedom to make choices based on my own preferences rather than other people's needs. My phone buzzed with a text from Charles. "Thank you for a wonderful evening. You're an extraordinary hostess and an even more extraordinary woman." I smiled, typing back, "Thank you for being such delightful company. Same time next week?" I wouldn't miss it. At 59, I was discovering that the best years of my life might still be ahead of me. I had a thriving business, a beautiful home, genuine friendships, and the possibility of love with someone who valued my independence rather than trying to exploit my generosity. Most importantly, I had the satisfaction of knowing that my refusal to continue enabling destructive behavior had led to genuine growth and positive change for everyone involved. Nathan had become a man I could respect and be proud of. Caroline had found her calling and her strength, and I had rediscovered who I was when I wasn't defined by my role as everyone's financial savior. The final toast wasn't one I spoke aloud, but one I offered silently to the woman I'd become, to Ashley Rashford, who learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say no, who discovered that being valued is better than being needed, who found that the best revenge against those who take advantage of your generosity is becoming someone who no longer needs to give it to feel worthy of love. It had taken a dinner party insult and a year of difficult decisions, but I'd finally learned to cut the golden strings that had been binding all of us to an unsustainable pattern. And everyone, it turned out, was better off for it. 5 years later, I received an invitation that made me pause over my morning coffee. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Caroline Elizabeth Matthews and David Michael Harrison. The invitation was elegant but simple, cream cardstock with classic black lettering, no unnecessary embellishments. It was exactly the kind of invitation someone would choose who had learned to appreciate substance over flash, meaning over materialism. Caroline was getting married. To David Harrison, Dr. Harrison, I assumed, recognizing the name of our family friend who had been at that fateful dinner party 5 years ago. The irony was delicious. Caroline was marrying someone from our original social circle, but this time as an independent woman with her own career and accomplishments rather than as a beautiful accessory seeking financial security. The invitation included a handwritten note. Dear Ashley, I know this might seem presumptuous, but I would be honored if you would attend my wedding. I understand if you'd prefer not to, but I wanted you to know that you're invited not out of obligation, but out of genuine gratitude for the role you played in helping me become someone worthy of real love. With respect and appreciation, Caroline. I showed the invitation to Charles over breakfast. At 76, he'd become a permanent fixture in my life, not living together, but spending most evenings and weekends at each other's homes. We'd found a comfortable rhythm that honored both our independence and our affection for each other. Are you going to go? He asked, studying the invitation over his reading glasses. I'm considering it. I'm curious about who Caroline has become, and about how she'll handle seeing you again. That too. According to Nathan, who'd maintained periodic contact with his ex-wife, Caroline had indeed become a different person. She'd completed her master's degree in social work and now ran a program that helped women over 40 re-enter the workforce after extended absences. She'd been profiled in several magazines as an expert on economic empowerment for women. She'd bought her own small house in Ohio and had become active in local politics. Most importantly, she'd apparently learned to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. Her engagement to David Harrison, recently widowed after a long, happy marriage, was reportedly based on shared values and genuine compatibility rather than economic convenience. I think I'd like to meet this new Caroline, I told Charles. Then we should go. I'd like to meet her too. The wedding was held at a small vineyard in Ohio, about a 4-hour drive from home. Charles and I made a weekend of it, staying at a charming bed and breakfast and treating the trip as a mini vacation. The ceremony was scheduled for late afternoon, and as we arrived at the venue, I was struck by how perfectly the setting matched what I'd heard about Caroline's transformation. The vineyard was beautiful but unpretentious, elegant but approachable. The kind of place chosen by someone who'd learned to appreciate natural beauty over artificial luxury. I spotted Nathan immediately. He was serving as an usher, looking handsome and confident in a well-tailored suit. He'd continued to thrive over the past 5 years, eventually starting his own marketing consultancy and building a reputation as one of the most innovative professionals in his field. He'd also begun dating someone, a fellow entrepreneur named Sarah, who matched his energy and ambition. Mom, Nathan's face lit up when he saw me. I'm so glad you came. I wouldn't have missed it. How's Caroline? Nervous, excited, beautiful. She's really something now, Mom. You'll see. The ceremony was held in a garden overlooking the vineyard, with about 60 guests in attendance. I recognized several faces from our old social circle, but there were many people I didn't know, presumably colleagues from Caroline's work, friends from her new life in Ohio, David's family, and connections. When Caroline appeared at the top of the garden steps, I actually gasped. She was stunning, but in a completely different way than she'd been 5 years ago. Gone was the carefully constructed perfection, the designer armor, the desperate glamour of someone trying to prove their worth through their appearance. This Caroline glowed with genuine happiness and confidence. Her dress was beautiful but simple, her hair styled naturally, her smile radiant with joy rather than performance. But what struck me most was how she carried herself. There was a groundedness to her movements, a sense of someone comfortable in her own skin, secure in her own worth. This was a woman who knew who she was and what she'd built, who didn't need external validation to feel valuable. David Harrison looked equally happy, and I could see genuine love and partnership in the way they looked at each other. This wasn't a transaction or a convenience. It was a celebration of two people who'd found each other after learning to be complete individuals. The ceremony was brief and heartfelt, with vows that emphasized partnership, growth, and mutual support. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the applause was genuine and joyful. At the reception, I found myself seated at a table with Nathan, Eleanor, who'd made the trip despite her usual reluctance to travel, and several of Caroline's colleagues from the nonprofit where she worked. The conversation was lively and intelligent, focusing on current events, shared interests, and the kind of topics that arose when people had things to talk about beyond gossip and material possessions.
Ashley.
Caroline appeared at my elbow during cocktail hour, looking nervous but determined. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for inviting me. Congratulations. You look absolutely radiant. I feel radiant. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, with exactly the right person, having built exactly the life I want. Caroline glanced around the reception, taking in the simple decorations, the modestly sized crowd, the unpretentious elegance of the celebration. It's a far cry from the wedding I thought I wanted when I was younger. Is it better? It's real. Everything here represents something David and I chose together, something we can actually afford, something that reflects who we actually are rather than who we thought we should pretend to be. A young woman approached our group, one of Caroline's colleagues, I gathered from her introduction. Mrs. Rashford, Caroline has told me so much about you, the woman said warmly. She credits you with changing her life. Oh, I don't think. No, it's true, Caroline interrupted. Ashley, you probably don't realize this, but you've become something of a legend in my work. I tell your story, our story, to women who are struggling to break free from financial dependence and learn to value themselves. You do. With your permission, I've been using our experience as a case study in how enabling behavior prevents growth, and how sometimes the most loving thing someone can do is refuse to continue rescuing someone from the consequences of their own choices. I was both surprised and touched by this revelation. And it helps. Enormously. So many women come to us trapped in patterns where they've never learned to value themselves beyond their ability to please others or maintain certain lifestyles. Your story shows them that it's possible to love someone and still refuse to enable their destructive behavior. Caroline paused, then looked directly at me. Ashley, I need you to know something. The woman standing here today, the woman who runs a successful program, who owns her own home, who's marrying for love instead of security, that woman exists because you loved me enough to let me fall. Caroline, I know you didn't set out to teach me a lesson. I know you were angry and hurt and fed up with being taken advantage of. But the result was that you gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, the opportunity to discover my own strength. The conversation was interrupted by the announcement that dinner was being served, but Caroline's words stayed with me throughout the evening. I'd spent years wondering if I'd been too harsh, if I'd damaged relationships beyond repair, if my refusal to continue enabling had caused more harm than good. Now I was discovering that my actions had not only led to positive change for Nathan and Caroline, but had become a model that was helping other women break free from similar patterns of dependence and enabling. During dinner, David Harrison stopped by our table to introduce himself properly. Mrs. Rashford, I've heard so much about you. I wanted to thank you personally. For what? For raising such a wonderful son, and for helping Caroline become the woman I fell in love with. David was warm and intelligent, with a kind of quiet confidence that came from a life spent in meaningful work. He was a pediatrician, I learned, who'd taken early retirement after his first wife's death and now volunteered at free clinics while pursuing his passion for photography. Caroline tells me you're responsible for her career change, he continued. I wouldn't go that far. She says that until you forced her to confront her own limitations, she'd never considered that she might have something valuable to contribute to the world beyond her appearance and social connections. David smiled. The woman I'm marrying is someone who gets up every morning excited about the work she's doing, the women she's helping, the difference she's making in the world. That woman might never have existed if you hadn't refused to continue supporting a lifestyle that was preventing her from growing. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversation with various guests who knew Caroline through her work. The picture that emerged was of someone who'd become a respected professional, a mentor to younger women, and an advocate for economic empowerment. She was known for her practical wisdom, her ability to help women see past their own limiting beliefs, and her understanding of the psychology of financial dependence. Caroline has this way of helping women understand that their worth isn't determined by their bank account or their ability to afford luxury, one colleague told me. She speaks from experience about how destructive it can be to define yourself through material possessions or financial dependence on others. She's particularly good with women who've been in long-term relationships where they've never had to be financially responsible, another added. She helps them see that independence isn't just about money, it's about self-respect and personal growth. As the reception wound down, Caroline approached me one final time. Ashley, I have something for you. She handed me a small, wrapped package. Inside was a book, a published collection of essays about women's economic empowerment, with Caroline listed as one of the contributing authors. My essay is about the experience of financial enabling and how it prevents personal growth, Caroline explained. I wrote about our story with names changed, of course, and about how your refusal to continue supporting my destructive behavior ultimately saved my life. I flipped to Caroline's essay, titled The Gift of Limits, How Learning to Say No Can Change Lives. The writing was thoughtful and honest, exploring the psychology of financial dependence and the courage required to break free from enabling relationships. Caroline, this is remarkable. It's been accepted for publication in several academic journals, too. I'm hoping it will help other families recognize the difference between helping and enabling. As Charles and I prepared to leave, Nathan walked us to our car. So, what did you think? He asked. I think Caroline has become exactly the person she was meant to be. And seeing her again? How is that for you? I considered the question carefully. Satisfying. Not in a vindictive way, but in the way it feels when a difficult decision turns out to have been exactly right. Nathan smiled.
Mom, I need you to know something. Watching Caroline transform over these past 5 years, seeing her build a life she's genuinely proud of, knowing that she's helping other women avoid the mistakes she made, it's made me appreciate what you did even more. Oh, you could have continued enabling us. It would have been easier, more comfortable, less confrontational. But you chose to do the hard thing, the loving thing, even when it made you look like the villain in our story. Nathan paused, looking back toward the reception where Caroline and David were saying goodbye to their guests. That woman in there, the confident, accomplished, genuinely happy woman who just married for love instead of security. She exists because you had the courage to let her fail. And I'm a better man because you had the courage to let me struggle. As Charles and I drove home through the quiet evening, I reflected on the unexpected turns my life had taken since that dinner party 5 years ago. I'd lost a daughter-in-law but gained a son. I'd ended an enabling relationship but gained genuine respect. I'd stopped being needed and discovered I was valued. Penny for your thoughts, Charles said, reaching over to take my hand. I was thinking about how strange life is. 5 years ago, I thought Caroline was my greatest disappointment. Today, I realized she might be one of my greatest successes. How so? Because the strongest thing I ever did was stop protecting her from reality. And the most loving thing I ever did was refuse to enable her destructive behavior. Charles squeezed my hand. The thing about cutting strings, he said thoughtfully, is that it reminds you that you were never really controlling the puppet. You were just preventing them from learning to dance. I smiled, recognizing the wisdom in his words. Caroline had indeed learned to dance, not the desperate performance she'd put on while dependent on my money, but the confident, graceful movements of someone who knew her own worth and had built her own stage. At 64, I was still learning and growing, still discovering new aspects of myself, still building relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. Nathan had become a man I was genuinely proud to call my son. Caroline had become a woman I was surprisingly proud to have known, even in her worst moments. And I had become Ashley Rashford, not the Leech Caroline had once called me, but the lioness who'd had the strength to let go when holding on would have hurt everyone involved. The thing about cutting golden strings, I realized, is that it doesn't just free the puppet, it reminds you that you never needed to be the puppet master to be worthy of love. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to discover their own strength. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the freedom to stop being responsible for everyone else's happiness. As we pulled into my driveway, I looked at my beautiful home, the place where this whole journey had begun with a dinner party and a cruel comment that had finally opened my eyes to years of being taken for granted. Tonight, it wasn't just a house where I lived alone. It was a sanctuary I'd reclaimed, a symbol of the life I'd built on my own terms. Nightcap? Charles asked as we walked to the door. Always. We settled into my living room with glasses of wine, and I found myself thinking about all the women Caroline was now helping through her work. Women who, like her, had spent years defining themselves through their relationships or their ability to maintain certain lifestyles. Women who had never learned that their worth came from within, not from what they could afford or who was willing to support them. You know what the most satisfying part of tonight was? I told Charles. What's that? Realizing that my story, our story, is helping other people break free from the same patterns. Caroline isn't just living a better life, she's using her experience to help other women find their strength. That must feel incredible. It does. For years, I wondered if I'd been too harsh, if I'd damaged our family irreparably. Tonight, I learned that my refusal to continue enabling destructive behavior has become a model for helping other families. Charles set down his wine glass and turned to face me fully. Ashley, do you realize what you've accomplished? Not just with Nathan and Caroline, but with your own life. What do you mean? 5 years ago, you were a successful businesswoman who was being taken advantage of by her own family. You were generous to a fault, but you were also being slowly drained by people who saw you as a resource rather than a person. And now you're a woman who's redefined what love means, who's shown that sometimes the most caring thing you can do is refuse to rescue someone from their own choices, who's demonstrated that enabling isn't kindness, it's a form of control that prevents growth. Charles reached for my hand. You've become someone who's loved and respected for who you are, not what you can provide. Your son treats you as an equal rather than a bank. Your former daughter-in-law credits you with changing her life. Your friends see you as a woman of principle rather than just a generous hostess. I suppose that's true. And personally, you've allowed yourself to be vulnerable with someone who appreciates your independence rather than trying to exploit your generosity. I smiled at this. Charles and I had built our relationship slowly, carefully, with mutual respect as our foundation. He'd never asked me for financial help, never suggested that I solve his problems, never treated me as anything other than an equal partner. It was the kind of relationship I'd never known was possible. I love you, Ashley Rashford, Charles said quietly. Not because you're generous, though you are. Not because you're successful, though you've achieved remarkable things. I love you because you're brave enough to do difficult things when they're right, strong enough to stand alone when necessary, and wise enough to know the difference between helping and enabling. I love you too, I replied, meaning it completely. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Outside, my gardens were settling into winter dormancy, preparing for spring's renewal. Inside, I felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived, choices well made, and love well earned. My phone buzzed with a text from Nathan. Thank you for coming tonight, Mom. Caroline wanted me to tell you that having you there felt like a blessing on her new beginning. Sweet dreams. I showed the message to Charles, who smiled. From Leech to blessing. Quite a transformation. For all of us. As we prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. At 64, I looked like a woman who was comfortable in her own skin, confident in her choices, secure in her worth. The stress lines from years of managing other people's crises had faded. The worry that had once shadowed my eyes had been replaced by a quiet contentment. This was what freedom looked like. Not just financial freedom, though I'd certainly achieved that through my own efforts. Not just social freedom, though I'd built genuine relationships based on mutual respect. But emotional freedom, the liberation that came from knowing I was valued for who I was, not what I could provide. In my study, I kept a small framed photo from Caroline's wedding, the four of us together. Nathan and Caroline, Charles and me. We were all smiling, but more than that, we all looked genuinely happy. Nathan looked like a man who'd found his strength. Caroline looked like a woman who'd discovered her purpose. Charles looked like someone grateful to be part of our unconventional family story. And I looked like exactly what I'd become. A woman who'd learned that the greatest revenge against those who underestimate you is becoming someone who no longer needs their approval to know your worth. The dinner party that had changed everything felt like a lifetime ago. The woman who'd sat at that table, absorbing insults while continuing to pay the bills of someone who held her in contempt, seemed like a stranger now. That Ashley had been generous but weak, loving but enabling, kind but lacking in self-respect. This Ashley, the one who'd cut the golden strings and allowed everyone to discover their own strength, was someone I was proud to be. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I realized that Caroline had been right about one thing 5 years ago. I had been a leech, but not in the way she'd meant it. I'd been a leech on my own happiness, draining my own energy by constantly solving other people's problems. I'd been a leech on my own self-respect, allowing myself to be treated poorly in exchange for being needed. I've been a leech on my own potential for genuine relationships, settling for financial dependence instead of demanding mutual respect. The woman who'd learned to stop being that kind of leech had discovered something remarkable. When you stop allowing people to take advantage of your generosity, you don't lose love, you find it. When you stop enabling destructive behavior, you don't destroy relationships, you save them. When you stop being needed and start being valued, you don't become alone, you become free. And freedom, I'd learned, was the greatest gift of all. What a journey! From dinner party insult to wedding blessing, Ashley really showed us what growth looks like. Drop your final thoughts in the comments. Team Ashley all the way, or do you think she could have handled things differently? If this story spoke to your soul, you know what to do. Smash that subscribe button, hit the like, and share this with anyone who needs to hear that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is learn to say no. Thanks for taking this incredible journey with me, and remember, you teach people how to treat you. Don't be afraid to cut those golden strings when they're holding everyone back. See you in the next story.